They cut her hair in the middle of the street, held her down in the dirt while the whole town watched, and not a single soul stepped forward. Her crime? Surviving a husband who should have died sooner. Her punishment? Everything that made her human, stripped away piece by piece. But what her tormentors didn't count on was the stranger at the edge of the crowd. A man who had spent 10 years avoiding trouble, 10 years keeping his head down, and his heart locked away. In 3 seconds, he made a choice that would change everything. This is their story. If you want to see how far this story travels, comment the city you're watching from, hit that like button, and stay with me until the very end. The heat came early to Bitter Creek that summer, settling over the town like a punishment nobody had earned but everybody expected. By noon, the air shimmered above the packed dirt streets, and even the dogs had sense enough to find shade beneath the wooden boardwalks. The few people who moved through town did so slowly, conserving energy, speaking in low voices as if the heat itself might take offense at anything louder. Luke Barrett had ridden in from his ranch an hour before dawn, hoping to finish his business at the feed store and the blacksmith before the worst of the day settled in. He'd managed the feed order without incident. 300 pounds of oats, 50 of corn, arranged for delivery by the end of the week. The blacksmith had taken longer, a disagreement about the quality of a replacement plow blade that Luke had finally settled by simply paying less than the asking price and walking away before Henderson could argue further. Now he stood in the narrow strip of shade outside the general store, rolling a cigarette he didn't particularly want, waiting for the heat to break just enough that he could face the ride home without feeling like he was being cooked alive in his own skin. He was a tall man, broad across the shoulders in a way that suggested years of physical labor rather than any particular effort at building himself up. His face was weathered, lined around the eyes and mouth, though he couldn't have been much past 35. Dark hair showed beneath the brim of his hat, and his eyes, gray, the color of storm clouds building over the mountains, carried a particular kind of distance that most people in Bitter Creek had learned not to question. Luke Barrett kept to himself. That was the beginning and the end of what most folks knew about him, and that was exactly how he preferred it. He'd owned the ranch outside town for going on 8 years now, purchased with money he'd earned doing work he never discussed, in places he never mentioned. The land was good, better than good, if a man was willing to put in the effort, and Luke had proven himself willing. 200 head of cattle, a small but growing herd of horses, fields that produced enough hay and grain to see everything through, even the harshest winters. He employed no hands, accepted no help, and rode into town only when necessity demanded it. The townspeople had theories, of course. They always did. Some said he was running from the law back east. Others whispered about a woman, a wife, maybe, or a sweetheart who died or betrayed him. A few of the more imaginative souls suggested he'd killed a man, maybe more than one, and was hiding from the consequences. Luke had never confirmed or denied any of it. He simply existed at the edges of their world, a figure seen but not known, present but never quite belonging. He was just about to light his cigarette when the scream cut through the heavy air. It was a woman's voice, high, raw, filled with a kind of terror that went beyond simple fear. The sound seemed to hang in the heat for a moment, suspended like something physical, before it was followed by another cry, this one shorter, more desperate. Luke's hand stopped halfway to his mouth, the unlit cigarette forgotten between his fingers. Around him, other people had heard it too. He could see them pausing on the boardwalk, turning their heads toward the sound. A young mother pulled her child closer against her skirts. An old man on a bench across the street leaned forward, squinting toward the narrow alley that ran between the hardware store and the abandoned assay office. But nobody moved. Not a single person took a step toward the sound. Another cry. Not a scream this time, but something worse. A sob, choked off before it could fully form, as if the person making it had lost even the right to weep. Luke dropped his cigarette in the dirt and walked toward the alley. He moved without hurrying, his boots making steady sounds against the packed earth. Other people watched him go, and he could feel their eyes on his back, but he didn't turn to look at them. Whatever was happening in that alley, it was bad enough that a whole town full of people had decided to pretend they couldn't hear it. That told him everything he needed to know. The alley was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast, and it smelled of old garbage and something else. something that made Luke's jaw tighten as he rounded the corner and saw what was waiting for him in the shadows. There were 6 of them, 5 men and 1 woman, arranged in a loose circle around a figure kneeling in the dirt. The men ranged from young to middle-aged, their faces marked by a particular kind of cruelty that Luke recognized immediately. The look of people who believed they had the right to do whatever they wanted, to whomever they wanted, without consequence. The woman was older, perhaps 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, and a face that might once have been handsome, but had long since hardened into something closer to granite. She stood slightly apart from the men, her arms crossed over her chest, watching the proceedings with an expression of cold satisfaction. And in the center of it all, on her knees in the dirt, was a young woman, or what was left of one. Her dress, once blue, Luke thought, though it was hard to tell now, had been torn at the shoulders, exposing pale skin already beginning to redden in the heat. Her face was smeared with something dark, soot maybe, or dirt deliberately rubbed into her skin. And her hair. Luke felt something twist in his chest. Her hair had been cut, not trimmed, not shortened, but hacked away in ragged chunks that left her scalp visible in patches. Long strands of it, brown, he thought, the color of autumn leaves, lay scattered in the dirt around her like fallen soldiers. One of the men, the youngest, barely more than a boy, was holding a knife in one hand and a fistful of her remaining hair in the other. He was laughing. "Hold still," he said, his voice carrying the particular brightness of someone enjoying himself. "We're not done yet." The woman in the dirt didn't move. She didn't fight, didn't try to pull away. She simply knelt there, her head bowed, her hands lying open and empty in her lap. She had stopped crying. She had stopped doing anything at all. That, more than anything else, made Luke Barrett step forward. "That's enough." His voice wasn't loud. He didn't shout, didn't thunder, but something in the way he spoke made everyone in that alley freeze. The young man with his knife turned first, his smile fading into confusion as he registered Luke's presence. "Who the hell are you?" "Nobody." Luke kept walking, moving into the circle with the same unhurried pace he'd used to cross the street. "Let her go." "This ain't your business, stranger." One of the older men stepped forward, the patriarch, Luke guessed, from the way the others shifted to make room for him. He was perhaps 55, with a thick gray beard and small, mean eyes that reminded Luke of a snake he'd once found in his barn. "This is family business, private business. She your family?" "She was married to my son." The man's voice carried a weight of proprietary anger that made Luke's skin crawl. "Before she killed him." The woman in the dirt flinched. It was the first movement she'd made since Luke had entered the alley, and something about it, the smallness of it, the involuntary nature, told him everything he needed to know about the truth of that accusation. "Did she?" "He died in her care," the older woman spoke now, her voice as cold and hard as her face. 6 months married, and she let him die. Stood by and watched while fever took him and never once called for help. There was no help to call. The words came from the woman on the ground, so quiet Luke almost missed them. The doctor was 3 days' ride away. By the time I knew how sick he was, silence! The patriarch's hand shot out, and the crack of his palm against her cheek echoed off the alley walls. "You don't speak. You don't get to speak. Not after what you did." The woman's head snapped to the side from the force of the blow, and when she straightened, Luke could see a thin line of blood at the corner of her mouth. But she didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She simply looked at the ground and waited for whatever came next. Luke had seen a lot of things in his 36 years. He'd seen men die in ways that still visited him in nightmares. He'd seen cruelty that defied understanding, violence that served no purpose beyond the pleasure of the person inflicting it. He'd learned, long ago, that the world was not a kind place, and that most people, given the choice between doing the right thing and doing the easy thing, would choose easy every single time. But standing in that alley, watching a woman wait to be destroyed by people who should have protected her, something shifted in his chest. Something that had been dormant for a very long time stirred, stretched, and refused to go back to sleep. "Here's what's going to happen," Luke said, his voice still calm, still quiet. "You're going to step back from her. All of you. And then I'm going to take her out of here, and none of you are going to say a word about it." The patriarch laughed, It was a harsh, ugly sound. And why would we do that? Because I'm asking nicely. Luke's hand moved to rest on the grip of the revolver at his hip. And I only asked nicely once. The alley went very still. Luke could feel them calculating, weighing the threat he represented against their desire to finish what they'd started. There were 5 of them, and only one of him, but he could see the uncertainty flickering in their eyes. They didn't know who he was. They didn't know what he was capable of. And that uncertainty was enough. "You're making a mistake," the patriarch said finally. "That woman is ours. She owes us for what she took, and we intend to collect." "She's not yours." Luke stepped forward, past the men, and crouched beside the woman in the dirt. Up close, he could see how badly she was shaking, fine tremors running through her whole body like the last vibrations of a struck bell. He could see the soot on her face, the blood at her mouth, the ragged places where her hair had been torn away. But he could also see her eyes. They were green, a deep, clear green, like spring grass after rain, and they were empty. "Ma'am," he spoke softly, the way he might speak to a frightened horse. "Can you stand?" She didn't answer, didn't move, just kept staring at nothing, her hands still lying open in her lap. "Ma'am," he tried again, "I need you to get up now. Can you do that for me?" Something flickered in those green eyes, a spark of something that might have been recognition, or might have been hope, or might have been nothing at all. Slowly, painfully, she nodded. Luke straightened and offered her his hand. After a long moment, she took it. Her fingers were ice cold despite the heat, and he could feel the bones beneath her skin, sharp and fragile as a bird's. He pulled her gently to her feet, steadying her when her legs threatened to buckle. "She's coming with me," he said, turning to face the family one last time. The patriarch's face had gone an ugly shade of red. "You don't know what you're doing. You don't know what she is." "I know what you are." Luke met the man's eyes without flinching. "And I know that if I ever see any of you near her again, we're going to have a very different kind of conversation." He turned his back on them and led the woman out of the alley. His horse was where he'd left it, tied to the post outside the general store. A tall bay gelding with a calm temperament and more sense than most people Luke had met. The horse's ears pricked forward as they approached, sensing something wrong in the way the woman moved, the way she held herself. "Easy," Luke murmured, running a hand down the horse's neck. "We're going to be fine." The woman stood beside him, swaying slightly, her eyes still carrying that terrible emptiness. She hadn't spoken since the alley, hadn't made a sound. Luke knew he should say something, offer some kind of explanation, some kind of reassurance. But the words stuck in his throat, inadequate to the moment. Instead, he simply lifted her onto the horse. She weighed almost nothing, a fact that troubled him more than he wanted to admit, and she didn't resist as he settled her in the saddle. Her hands came up automatically to grip the pommel, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. Luke swung up behind her, one arm wrapping around her waist to keep her steady. She stiffened at the contact, and he felt the tremors running through her intensify. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said quietly. "I'm going to take you somewhere safe, that's all." She didn't respond, but after a moment she stopped shaking quite so hard. Luke touched his heels to the horse's sides, and they moved out of town. The ride to the ranch took just over 2 hours. Luke could have pushed harder, made better time, but the woman in his arms was barely holding on, and he didn't want to risk her falling. So he kept the pace easy, following the familiar trail through scrub brush and scattered pines, up into the foothills where his land began. She didn't speak for the entire ride, didn't move except to adjust her grip when the terrain grew rough. Luke found himself acutely aware of her presence, the smell of soot and fear that clung to her, the way her breath came shallow and quick, the fragile architecture of her bones beneath his arm. He'd made a decision back there in that alley, an impulsive, irrational decision that went against everything he'd built his life around for the past 8 years. He didn't know this woman, didn't know her story, her circumstances, whether she was truly innocent or complicit in whatever had brought her to that moment in the dirt. And it didn't matter. What mattered was that 6 people had decided she deserved to be destroyed, and not one other person in that entire town had lifted a finger to stop them. What mattered was the emptiness in her eyes, the terrible acceptance with which she'd knelt and waited for the next blow. He knew that look. He'd seen it before, in a different time, in a different place. He'd worn it himself once. The ranch came into view as the afternoon shadows started to lengthen, a modest cabin built of local timber, weathered to a soft gray by years of sun and snow. Beyond it, a barn that Luke had expanded twice since purchasing the property, corrals for the horses, and pastures that rolled away toward the mountains in waves of green and gold. It wasn't much by some standards, but it was his. The only thing in this world that belonged solely to him, purchased with labor and sweat and the deliberate erasure of everything that had come before. He guided the horse to a stop beside the cabin's front porch and dismounted carefully, keeping one hand on the woman's arm to steady her. "We're here," he said, unnecessarily. She looked at the cabin, then at the surrounding land, with an expression he couldn't read. After a moment, she slid from the saddle, not gracefully, but without falling, and stood with her arms wrapped around herself, as if trying to hold her body together. "Inside," Luke said. "You need water, food, rest." He started toward the cabin, then stopped when he realized she wasn't following. Turning back, he found her still standing beside the horse, staring at him with those empty green eyes. Why? The word came out cracked, broken, like something that had been unused too long. "Why did you help me?" Luke considered the question. He could give her a dozen answers, because it was right, because he couldn't stand by, because something in her face had reminded him of something he'd rather forget. All of them were true. None of them were the whole truth. "Because you looked like you needed help," he said finally, "and because nobody else was going to give it." She stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded and followed him inside. The cabin was sparse but clean, a main room that served as kitchen and living space, a bedroom beyond, a small storage area in the back. Luke had never seen any reason to acquire more than he needed, and the evidence of that philosophy was everywhere. A single chair at the rough-hewn table, a single plate and cup drying beside the basin, a single set of everything necessary and nothing more. He moved to the wood stove and stirred the banked coals back to life, adding fresh wood until the flames caught. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair. "I'll heat some water." The woman hesitated, then crossed to the chair and lowered herself into it, as if she expected it to collapse beneath her weight. Her hands came to rest on the table, pale against the dark wood, and she stared at them as if they belonged to someone else. Luke filled a pot from the rain barrel outside and set it on the stove to heat. Then he went to the small cupboard and gathered what he had: dried beef, hard biscuits, a jar of preserves he'd traded for last winter. Simple fare, but more than enough for one meal. He set the food on the table in front of her and stepped back. She didn't touch it. "You need to eat," Luke said. "I don't know your name." Her voice was still rough, still broken, but there was something different in it now, a spark of something that might, eventually, become strength. "You took me from that place, brought me all this way, and I don't even know your name." "Luke Barrett." "I'm Mara." She paused. "Mara Hale. Although I suppose they would say I don't have the right to that name anymore." "What would you say?" She looked up at him, and for the first time since the alley, something like emotion flickered in her green eyes. "I would say I stopped caring about what they think a long time ago." Luke nodded. It was the first honest thing either of them had said since this began. "There's a washroom behind the bedroom," he said. "When the water's hot, you can clean up. I'll find something for you to wear." "Why are you helping me?" she asked again, more quietly this time. "And don't tell me it's because I needed help. A lot of people need help. Most of them never get it." Luke stood very still for a moment, considering his answer. The truth was complicated, too complicated for this moment, for this stranger who had been through too much already today. But she deserved something, some small piece of honesty to hold on to. "Because a long time ago," he said slowly, "someone should have helped me. And no one did." Mara's eyes widened slightly. Then she nodded once and reached for a biscuit. It was a small thing, a tiny gesture of trust, of acceptance. But watching her eat, watching some of the terrible tension slowly drain from her shoulders, Luke felt something loosen in his own chest. He'd made a decision today, an impulsive, irrational decision that was going to bring nothing but trouble, and for the first time in 8 years, he didn't regret it. The water was hot by the time Mara had eaten enough to satisfy Luke's worried glances. He'd watched her like she might collapse at any moment, his gray eyes never quite leaving her face, and she couldn't decide whether to find it comforting or unnerving. She'd spent the last 6 months being watched and judged and found wanting, over and over again, until she'd started to believe what they said about her, that she was worthless, that she was a murderer, that she deserved everything that was coming to her. But Luke Barrett watched her differently. He watched her like she was something fragile that needed protecting, not something broken that needed punishing. And that small distinction made all the difference. "The washroom's through there," he said, pointing toward the back of the cabin. "I'll leave clean clothes outside the door." Mara rose from the chair, her legs steadier now than they'd been an hour ago. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet." His voice carried a warning she didn't quite understand. "We're not out of trouble. Those people, your husband's family, they're not going to let this go." "I know." She'd known it even as Luke led her out of that alley, even as the town fell away behind them. Samuel's family didn't forgive, didn't forget. They held grudges like other people held treasures, polishing them, nurturing them, waiting for the perfect moment to cash them in. "I know what they're capable of." "Then you know we need to be prepared." She studied him for a moment, this stranger who had stepped between her and destruction without hesitation, without apparent thought for the consequences. He wasn't a large man, not in the way that implied obvious physical threat, but there was something about the way he held himself, a coiled readiness, a sense of barely contained capability that suggested he knew exactly how to handle himself if trouble came calling. "Who are you, Luke Barrett?" she asked softly. "Really?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Just a man, nothing more." Men who are just men don't stand up to 5 armed strangers without flinching. They don't offer sanctuary to women they've never met. She took a step toward him, close enough now to see the flecks of darker gray in his storm cloud eyes. "Who are you?" For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, slowly, his shoulders relaxed, and he shook his head. "Someone who got tired of standing by," he said. "Now go clean up. We can talk more later." It wasn't an answer, not really, but Mara found she could accept it, at least for now. She had her own secrets, her own shadows. Who was she to demand someone else's? She walked past him toward the back of the cabin, pausing at the doorway. "Luke?" He looked up. "Thank you for everything today. Whatever happens next, I need you to know that." She swallowed against the sudden tightness in her throat. "No one has stood up for me in a very long time. I'd forgotten what it felt like." Something shifted in his expression, something soft. Something almost tender, there and gone in the space of a heartbeat. "Get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." She nodded and disappeared into the back room, leaving him alone with his thoughts and the slowly dying fire. The washroom was small, barely large enough for the tin tub and a wooden bench, but it was private, and that was all Mara cared about. She stripped off her ruined dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons, her skin crawling with the memory of hands that had grabbed and torn and violated. The water in the tub was warm, heated by the stovepipe that ran along the wall, and she lowered herself into it slowly, hissing as the warmth touched her bruised skin. For a long moment, she simply sat there, her head bowed, her hands pressed flat against her stomach, breathing. She was alive. Against all odds, against everything that should have happened, she was alive. The tears came without warning, great racking sobs that shook her whole body, that echoed off the narrow walls and filled the small space with the sound of grief finally released. She'd been holding it in for so long. The day Samuel died, and his family's eyes had turned cold and accusing. The months that followed, trapped in their house, treated like a prisoner, like something less than human. The trial that wasn't a trial. The judgment that had been decided long before anyone pretended to hear her defense. And today, the public humiliation, carefully orchestrated to break what was left of her spirit. The hands on her hair, the knife cutting and cutting and cutting until she felt like she was watching it happen to someone else. She cried until there was nothing left, until her throat was raw and her eyes burned and her body felt emptied of everything but exhaustion. Then she reached for the cloth and soap Luke had left and began, slowly, methodically, to wash the shame from her skin. The soot came away first, the black marks they'd smeared across her face, the visible badge of her supposed disgrace. Then the dirt, ground into her palms from kneeling in the alley. Then the blood, dried rust brown at the corner of her mouth. When she was clean, she emptied the tub and stood, catching her reflection in the small mirror mounted on the wall. She barely recognized herself. Her hair, her beautiful hair, the one vanity she'd allowed herself that had fallen past her waist in waves of chestnut brown, was gone. What remained stood up in ragged patches, uneven and wild, a constant reminder of what they'd done. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp beneath skin that had lost all color. Her eyes, once bright with hope and ambition, now stared back at her like the eyes of a ghost. Mara Hale, age 23. Widow. Accused murderer. Cast out. She turned away from the mirror, unable to bear the sight any longer, and reached for the clothes Luke had promised. They were there on the bench, a man's shirt, worn soft with age, and a pair of trousers that would be too big but could be belted. Clean, simple, offering nothing but function. She dressed quickly and opened the door. Luke was sitting at the table, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him, staring at nothing in particular. He looked up as she emerged, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or recognition of how thoroughly she'd been transformed. "Better?" he asked. "Cleaner?" She moved to the chair across from him and sat down, her movements careful, deliberate. "Better might take a while." "Fair enough." He pushed a second cup toward her, coffee, black and strong. "How much trouble am I in, Mara Hale?" She wrapped her hands around the cup, letting the heat seep into her cold fingers. "More than you know." "Tell me." So she did. "His name was Samuel Garrett," she began, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "His family owns half the land around Bitter Creek. Cattle, mining rights, timber. If there's money to be made in that valley, the Garretts have their fingers in it." Luke nodded, his expression giving nothing away. "I've heard the name." "Everyone has." Mara stared into her coffee, watching the dark surface ripple with her breath. "He was their golden son, the heir to everything. Handsome, charming, beloved by everyone who didn't have to live with him. And you married him." "I didn't have a choice." The words came out bitter, sharp-edged. "My father owed them money. A lot of money, accumulated over years of bad luck and worse decisions. When he died, the debt passed to me, and the Garretts made it very clear that I could pay it off in one of two ways. I could work for them until I'd earned enough to clear what was owed, which they estimated would take approximately 20 years. Or I could marry Samuel and wipe the slate clean." She laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I was 18, alone, scared, with no family and no prospects. Marriage to a wealthy man seemed like the better option." She looked up, meeting Luke's eyes. "I was wrong." "What happened?" "At first, nothing. Samuel was distant, I suppose. Not cruel, but not kind either. We lived in the same house, ate at the same table, but he barely acknowledged my existence. I thought perhaps it would get better with time. I was wrong about that, too." She paused, gathering the words that had never before been spoken aloud. "He was sick, had been for years, though the family kept it hidden. Some kind of wasting disease that the doctors couldn't name, couldn't cure. He was dying by inches, and they'd married him off to me hoping that a wife might somehow make a difference. Give him something to live for, perhaps. Or maybe just give them someone to blame when the inevitable finally happened." "And when he died?" "They said I killed him." Mara's voice cracked on the last word, but she forced herself to continue. "Said I'd neglected him, refused to call for help, let him suffer alone while I did nothing. They said I wanted him dead so I could be free." "Did you?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. "Did I want to be free?" Mara met his gaze steadily. "Every single day. Did I kill him? No. I sat beside his bed for 3 weeks while he wasted away. I held his hand while he coughed blood. I was the only person in that house who bothered to tell him he wasn't alone." Her voice hardened. "But his mother needed someone to blame, and I was convenient." Luke was quiet for a long moment, turning his cup in his hands. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. How long since he died? 6 months. 6 months of living in that house, under their control, waiting for them to decide my punishment. She touched her ruined hair with trembling fingers. Today was supposed to be the beginning. They were going to parade me through town, let everyone see what happens to women who dare to outlive their usefulness. Then they were going to send me to the mines. The mines? Garrett property. They have crews working there, men mostly, but some women too. Debtors, criminals, anyone they can get their hands on. The conditions? She shook her head. No one lasts more than a few years. I would have died there eventually. That was the point. Luke's jaw tightened. And no one tried to stop them. Who would? The sheriff is in their pocket, the judge, the mayor, half the businessmen in town. The Garretts own Bitter Creek, body and soul. Going against them means destruction. Yet here we are. Mara looked at him, really looked at him, this stranger who had upended his life for someone he'd never met. Yes, here we are. Which brings me back to my original point. You've made an enemy today, Luke Barrett. A powerful enemy with a long memory and no mercy. Whatever trouble you imagined when you stepped into that alley, the reality is going to be worse. I've had worse enemies. Have you? She leaned forward, trying to read the truth in his storm-gray eyes. Have you really? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he rose from the table and walked to the window, looking out at the fading light. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, and for a moment he was just a silhouette against the fire. When I was 20 years old, he said finally, his voice quiet, I watched my father beat my mother to death. Stood there in our kitchen, unable to move, while he hit her again and again until she stopped breathing. Mara's breath caught in her throat. He told me afterward that if I ever said a word, he'd do the same to me. And I believed him, so I kept quiet, helped him bury her behind the barn, told the neighbors she'd run off, lived in that house for another 2 years pretending nothing had happened. His shoulders tightened. When I finally left, I swore I'd never stand by again. Never watch something terrible happen and do nothing. He turned back to face her, and in the dying light his eyes were no longer storm clouds, but something fiercer, something closer to lightning. So yes, Mara Hale, I've had worse enemies than the Garrett family, and I'm still standing. The silence that followed was different from before, charged with shared understanding, with the recognition of two wounded souls who had somehow found each other in the darkness. I'm sorry, Mara whispered. About your mother. About everything. Don't be sorry, just survive. He moved back to the table and sat down across from her. We're going to figure this out. I don't know how yet, but we will. In the meantime, you're safe here. No one's going to hurt you. Not while I'm breathing. She wanted to believe him, wanted it more than she'd wanted anything in a very long time. And if they come for me, then they'll find out exactly what kind of enemy they've made. Mara looked at him, this stranger, this rescuer, this man who carried his own scars with the dignity she could only aspire to, and felt something shift in her chest. Not hope, exactly. It was too soon for hope, but something adjacent to it, a beginning. All right, she said softly. All right. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear one by one, scattered across the darkness like promises waiting to be kept. Luke gave her the bedroom that night. She tried to protest, but he cut her off with a shake of his head and pointed toward the door without discussion. The bed was simple, a wooden frame, a mattress stuffed with straw and wool, blankets worn soft with use, but it was clean and private, and that was more than she'd had in 6 months. She lay in the darkness, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the creak of timber settling, the whisper of wind through the pines, and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. Her mind kept returning to the alley, the knife in Jacob's hand, the satisfaction on Margaret Garrett's face, the weight of a dozen eyes watching her destruction with varying degrees of discomfort and delight. And then Luke. Luke stepping forward when no one else would. Luke speaking 3 words that had changed everything. She's coming with me. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. Her hand came up to touch her ruined hair, fingers finding the ragged edges, the patches where her scalp showed through. They'd taken so much from her, her freedom, her dignity. her future. They'd taken her hair, the one piece of beauty she'd been allowed to keep, and turned it into a weapon against her. But they hadn't broken her. That realization settled over her like a second blanket, warm and unexpected. Through everything, the months of imprisonment, the endless accusations, the public humiliation she had endured, she was still here, still breathing, still capable of getting up tomorrow and facing whatever came next. They hadn't broken her. And with Luke Barrett standing between her and the darkness, maybe, just maybe, they never would. She closed her eyes and finally, mercifully, slept. Luke didn't sleep. He sat in the chair by the cold fireplace, a rifle across his knees, and watched the darkness beyond the window. The moon had risen late, a thin sliver that cast barely enough light to see by, and the shadows seemed to press against the glass like living things. He'd made a decision today, a decision that was going to have consequences far beyond what he could predict or control. The Garretts weren't going to let this go, weren't going to let her go, and sooner or later they were going to come looking. When they did, he'd be ready. He thought about what Mara had told him, the husband who'd been sick, the family who'd needed someone to blame, the 6 months of captivity, waiting for a punishment that had finally arrived in the form of knives and soot and public humiliation. He thought about the emptiness in her eyes when he'd found her in that alley, the way she'd knelt in the dirt and waited for the next blow, as if she'd given up on the possibility that anything else could happen. He thought about his mother. The memories came unbidden, the way they always did in the dark hours. Her voice, soft and tired, telling him to run and hide. The sounds from the kitchen, muffled by distance but unmistakable. The silence afterwards stretching on and on until it became its own kind of violence. He'd been a coward then. A boy, yes, but still a coward. He'd hidden behind the barn door and listened to his mother die, and then he'd helped bury her body and pretended it had never happened. It had taken him years to forgive himself for that, longer still to understand that the real enemy wasn't his own fear, but the system that had made such fear necessary. A world where men like his father could do whatever they wanted, where women like his mother had no recourse, where children learned early that survival sometimes meant staying silent. He'd left that world behind, built a new life, a new identity, a new way of being. And for 8 years, it had been enough. But today, standing in that alley, watching history prepare to repeat itself, he'd made a choice. No more silence. No more standing by. Whatever came next, he would face it with his eyes open and his conscience clear. The night stretched on, and Luke Barrett kept watch, and somewhere in the bedroom behind him, a woman who had been told she was worthless finally slept in peace. The sun rose over the mountains, painting the ranch in shades of gold and amber, and a new day began. The first week passed in a rhythm that Mara barely recognized, a rhythm of safety, of quiet, of moments strung together without the constant undercurrent of fear. She woke each morning to the sound of Luke moving through the cabin, the clatter of the coffee pot, the creak of the door as he headed out to tend the animals. She ate meals at his table, slept in his bed, wore clothes borrowed from his sparse wardrobe, and slowly, imperceptibly, she began to remember what it felt like to breathe without waiting for the next blow. Luke gave her space. He seemed to understand, without being told, that she needed time to find her footing, time to exist without someone watching her every move, judging her every choice. He asked no questions about her past beyond what she'd already shared, made no demands on her time or energy. He simply went about his work and let her find her own way. On the third day, she started helping. It began small, washing dishes after breakfast, sweeping the cabin floor, tasks that required little thought and less conversation. But it felt good to be useful, to contribute something instead of simply taking. And Luke, though he never said so directly, seemed to appreciate the effort. "You don't have to do that," he said one morning, watching her scrub the coffee pot with more vigor than strictly necessary. "I know." She didn't look up from her work. "I want to." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded and went outside to check on the horses, and something unspoken settled between them, an understanding that this arrangement, whatever it was, would work best if they both contributed. By the 5th day, Mara had ventured beyond the cabin. The ranch was larger than she'd realized, sprawling across a valley that opened onto mountain pastures to the north and thick pine forest to the east. Luke ran cattle, She could see them in the distance, dark shapes moving slowly across the green, and kept a small herd of horses in the corrals near the barn. There was a vegetable garden behind the cabin, somewhat overgrown but still producing, and a chicken coop that yielded enough eggs for breakfast each morning. It was a working operation, maintained by one man with no help and no visitors. The isolation that had seemed so stark when she'd first arrived now felt different, not lonely, but peaceful. A deliberate distance from a world that had proven itself unworthy of trust. She understood that impulse better than she wanted to admit. On the sixth morning, Mara found Luke in the barn, mending a saddle that had seen better days. She stood in the doorway, watching his hands move with practiced ease, and felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized was tight. "Can I ask you something?" He looked up, his gray eyes finding hers in the dim light. "Depends on what it is." "Why did you really help me?" She stepped into the barn, her borrowed boots scuffing against the packed dirt floor. "You told me about your mother, about why you couldn't stand by, but there's more to it than that, isn't there?" Luke set down the saddle and turned to face her fully. In the week since he'd brought her here, she'd learned to read the subtle shifts in his expression, the way his jaw tightened when he was uncomfortable, the slight narrowing of his eyes when he was thinking something through. Right now, both of those things were happening at once. "What makes you say that?" "Because you don't just live out here alone by accident. Because you handled those men in the alley like someone who's done it before. Because you haven't asked me a single question about what really happened with Samuel, even though you must be curious." She crossed her arms over her chest, holding herself together. "You're hiding from something, Luke Barrett. And I think whatever it is, it's connected to why you saved me." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the soft sounds of horses shifting in their stalls. "You're observant," he said finally. "More observant than most people." "I've had practice. When you live with people who want to destroy you, you learn to pay attention." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, maybe, or respect. He picked up the saddle again, running his fingers along the worn leather as if it held some kind of answer. "Before I came here," he said slowly, "I was a different man, did things I'm not proud of, worked for people who didn't care who got hurt as long as they got what they wanted." He paused, his hands going still. "I told myself it was necessary, told myself I didn't have a choice, but there's always a choice. I just didn't want to make it." "What changed?" "I met someone, a woman, like you, trapped in a situation that wasn't her fault, surrounded by people who treated her like property." His voice went rough around the edges. "I was supposed to bring her back to the man who'd bought her. That was my job. Instead, I helped her escape." Mara's breath caught in her throat. "What happened to her?" "She got away, started a new life somewhere far from here, under a different name. Last I heard, she was happy." He looked up, meeting her eyes with an intensity that made her heart stutter. "But the people I worked for didn't take kindly to being crossed. I spent 3 years looking over my shoulder, waiting for them to catch up with me. When I finally stopped running, I came here, built this place, told myself I was done with all of it. And then you walked into that alley. And then I walked into that alley." He shook his head slowly, something almost like wonder in his expression. "I stood there watching those people hurt you, and it was like the last 10 years had never happened. Like I was right back where I'd started, looking at someone who needed help and trying to decide whether I had the courage to give it. But you did give it. This time." He set the saddle aside and rose to his feet, moving toward her until only a few inches separated them. "I spent a long time being the kind of man who looked the other way. I don't want to be that man anymore. I don't want to wake up one day and realize I've become my father, someone who sees suffering and doesn't care." Mara looked up at him, this stranger who had become something else in the span of a week. A protector, a confessor, a fellow survivor. She thought about all the people who had failed her, all the hands that had hurt instead of helped, all the eyes that had looked away when she needed them most. And she thought about Luke stepping forward in that alley, speaking 3 words that had saved her life. "You're not your father," she said softly. "And you're not the man you used to be. I can see that." "How?" "Because you're standing here telling me the truth. Because you gave me a place to stay without asking for anything in return. Because you've treated me like a person every single day, even when I could barely remember how to be one. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly, and touched his arm. That's not who you were. That's who you are. Luke stared at her for a long moment, something shifting behind his eyes. Then, slowly, he covered her hand with his own. Mara. The sound of hoofbeats cut him off. Luke's head snapped toward the barn door, his whole body going tense in an instant. Without a word, he moved past her and stepped outside, his hand already reaching for the rifle that was never far from his side. Mara followed, her heart hammering against her ribs. A rider was approaching from the south, a single figure on a dark horse, moving at an easy pace that suggested he wasn't in any particular hurry. Luke watched him come, his jaw tight, his eyes narrowed against the morning sun. "Get inside," he said quietly. "Who is it?" "I don't know, but until I do, I want you out of sight." Mara hesitated, torn between the instinct to obey and the need to know what was happening. In the end, self-preservation won out. She slipped back into the barn, pressing herself against the wall just inside the door, where she could see without being seen. The rider drew closer, resolving into a man in his 50s with a weathered face and a tin star pinned to his chest. He reined in his horse about 20 feet from where Luke stood and touched the brim of his hat in greeting. "Morning, Barrett." "Sheriff." Luke's voice was flat, giving nothing away. "You're a long way from town." "That I am." "The sheriff." Mara didn't recognize him from Bitter Creek, which meant he must be from one of the other settlements in the territory, swung down from his saddle with the ease of long practice. "Mind if we talk?" "Depends on what you want to talk about." The sheriff's eyes swept the ranch, taking in the barn, the cabin, the corrals. If he noticed anything out of place, he didn't show it. "Got a complaint filed in Bitter Creek yesterday. Family named Garrett claims you kidnapped a woman. Took her right out of the middle of town, against her will." "Against her will." Luke's voice carried a dangerous edge. "That's interesting. Figured you might have a different perspective on the situation." The sheriff moved closer, his boots crunching on the dry grass. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Luke was silent for a moment, and Mara could see him weighing his options. He could lie, to tell the sheriff that the Garretts were mistaken, that there was no woman here, that the whole thing was a misunderstanding. But if the sheriff decided to search the property, the lie would fall apart immediately. "I didn't kidnap anyone," Luke said finally. "I stopped a group of people from torturing a woman in broad daylight, and I brought her here because she had nowhere else to go." "Torturing?" The sheriff raised an eyebrow. "That's a strong word. You should see what they did to her hair, what they did to her face." Luke's hands tightened on the rifle. "They were treating her like an animal, Sheriff, cutting her, smearing her with filth, making a spectacle of her suffering. And not one person in that whole damn town lifted a finger to stop them. The Garretts say she killed their son." "The Garretts are liars." The words hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. The sheriff studied Luke for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "That may be," he said slowly, "but they're also powerful liars. They've got friends in places that matter. The territorial governor, the federal marshal, half the judges in the region. If they want to make trouble for you, they can make plenty of it." "Is that a warning?" "It's a fact." The sheriff glanced toward the barn, and Mara pressed herself further back into the shadows. "I'm not here to drag anyone back to Bitter Creek. That's not my jurisdiction, and frankly, I don't much like the Garretts or their methods. But I'm here to tell you that this isn't over. They're not going to let this go." "I didn't expect them to." "Then I hope you're prepared for what comes next." The sheriff turned back toward his horse, then paused, his hand on the saddle horn. "One more thing, Barrett. If there is a woman here, and I'm not saying there is, you might want to think about making things official. Marriage, maybe, or some kind of legal arrangement that would complicate their claim on her. It won't stop them completely, but it might slow them down." Luke said nothing, his face as closed as a locked door. The sheriff mounted his horse and gathered the reins. "Watch yourself, both of you." He rode away without looking back, and Mara stayed hidden until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Then Luke's voice, quiet but clear. "You can come out now?" She emerged from the barn, her legs unsteady beneath her. "He knows I'm here." "He suspects. It's not the same thing." Luke lowered the rifle, but his body remained tense. "He's not wrong, though. The Garretts aren't going to give up. They'll keep pushing until they get what they want. And what do they want? You know the answer to that. She did. They wanted her destroyed, her freedom, her dignity, her life. They wanted to make an example of her, to demonstrate what happened to women who dared to outlive their usefulness. Nothing less would satisfy them. What do we do? She asked. Luke turned to face her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something like uncertainty in his eyes. I don't know yet, but we'll figure it out. Together? The word hung between them, weighted with implications neither of them was ready to examine. Together, Luke said finally. And despite everything, the threat, the uncertainty, the shadow of the Garrett family looming over them both, Mara felt something warm kindle in her chest. Hope. Small, fragile, easily extinguished. But there. The days that followed took on a different quality. The easy rhythm of the first week gave way to something more purposeful, more urgent. Luke began teaching Mara things she'd never learned: how to handle a rifle, how to saddle a horse, how to read the land for signs of approaching riders. She absorbed it all with a hunger that surprised them both, as if some part of her had been waiting her whole life for this kind of knowledge. "You're a quick study," Luke said one afternoon, watching her reload the rifle with steady hands. "I've never had anyone teach me anything useful before." She raised the weapon to her shoulder, sighting down the barrel at a target he'd set up near the tree line. "My father believed women should be decorative, not capable. And Samuel—" She trailed off, her finger tightening on the trigger. Samuel didn't believe in anything at all. The rifle cracked, and the tin can she'd been aiming at spun off its perch. "Good," Luke said. Again. She fired 3 more rounds, hitting 2 out of 3, then lowered the weapon and turned to face him. "Tell me more about them, the Garretts. What are we really dealing with?" Luke was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Marcus Garrett, the patriarch, the one who hit you. He's been running that family for 30 years, built the empire from nothing, or so he likes to claim. In reality, he inherited a decent stake from his father and expanded it through methods that wouldn't bear much scrutiny." "What kind of methods?" "The usual. Driving out smaller ranchers, buying up land cheap when owners couldn't pay their debts, using his connections to get favorable rulings in disputes." Luke's jaw tightened. "He's smart, I'll give him that. Knows how to work the system, how to keep his hands technically clean while others do the dirty work." "And his wife, Margaret? Worse in some ways. Marcus is cruel because it serves his interests. Margaret is cruel because she enjoys it." He met Mara's eyes, his gaze steady. "What they did to you in that alley, that was her idea. I'd stake my life on it." Mara shuddered, remembering the cold satisfaction on the older woman's face. "She never liked me. From the moment I entered that house, she treated me like something she'd scraped off her boot." "Did she ever say why?" "She didn't have to. I was an outsider, poor, common, with no family name or connections. In her eyes, I was never good enough for her son." Mara's voice went bitter. "Of course, her son spent most of our marriage ignoring me completely. But that didn't matter. I was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of being ignored." "What was he like? Samuel?" The question caught her off guard. Luke had never asked about her husband before, never pressed for details about the marriage or the man himself. She'd assumed he didn't want to know or didn't care. "He was broken," she said finally. "I didn't see it at first. He was charming when he wanted to be, when there was something he needed. But underneath all that charm, there was just emptiness, like someone had hollowed him out and left only the shell." "The sickness?" "That was part of it, but I think he'd been that way long before he got sick. His parents raised him to believe he was special, that the rules didn't apply to him, that everything he wanted would be handed to him without effort, and then he spent his whole life discovering that wasn't true." She shook her head slowly. "He didn't know how to want something, didn't know how to work for anything, so he just stopped trying." Luke absorbed this in silence, his expression thoughtful. "And when he died?" "He was almost relieved, I think. At the end." Her voice dropped to barely a whisper. "He told me the night before. He said he was tired, that he'd been tired for a long time, that maybe dying was better than living like this." "And you stayed with him?" "Of course I did. Whatever else he was a human being. No one deserves to die alone. She looked up, meeting Luke's eyes with a fierceness that surprised her. That's what his family never understood. They wanted to blame me for his death because they needed someone to blame. But I didn't kill him. I was the only person in that house who actually tried to help him. I believe you. 3 simple words, but they hit Mara like a physical force. She'd spent 6 months being told that no one would ever believe her, that her story didn't matter, that the truth was whatever the Garretts decided it was. And here was Luke Barrett, a man who owed her nothing, looking at her with complete conviction. Why? She asked, her voice rough. You weren't there. You don't know what really happened. I know you, he said simply. Maybe not everything, not yet, but I know enough. I know you're not capable of letting someone die when you could have helped them. I know you're stronger than anyone's given you credit for. And I know that the Garretts are exactly the kind of people who would rather destroy someone than admit they might be wrong. Mara felt tears prick at her eyes, and she turned away, not wanting him to see. You give me too much credit. Maybe, or maybe everyone else hasn't given you nearly enough. He moved closer, his presence warm and solid at her back. Either way, we're in this together now, and I don't plan on letting them win. She wiped her eyes and turned to face him, finding him closer than she'd expected, close enough that she could see the individual flecks of darker gray in his storm cloud eyes, the fine lines around his mouth, the stubble darkening his jaw. Luke, we should get back. His voice was rough, and he stepped away before she could say anything else. Storm's coming in. I want to make sure the animals are secure. He was right. She could see the clouds building over the western mountains, dark and heavy with rain. But she knew that wasn't really why he'd pulled away. There was something growing between them, something neither of them had expected or planned for, and they were both too damaged, too cautious, too afraid of disappointment to acknowledge it out loud. Not yet, anyway. They walked back to the cabin in silence, the first drops of rain beginning to fall as they reached the door. The storm hit hard that night, wind howling around the cabin like something alive and angry. Mara lay in Luke's bed. She'd stopped thinking of it as borrowed and started thinking of it as hers, listening to the thunder roll across the mountains and trying not to think about the last time she'd weathered a storm like this. It had been 3 weeks before Samuel died. He'd been too sick to get out of bed by then, his breath coming in rattling gasps that echoed through the empty house. The storm had knocked out the lamps, and she'd sat beside him in the darkness, holding his hand and telling him stories to fill the silence. He hadn't answered, hadn't even seemed to hear her, but she'd kept talking anyway because the alternative was admitting that she was completely, utterly alone. She wasn't alone now. The thought came unbidden, and with it, a warmth that had nothing to do with the blankets piled on the bed. Luke was out there in the main room, probably sitting in his usual chair with his rifle across his knees, keeping watch like he did every night. She'd tried to tell him he didn't need to, tried to convince him that a locked door and a sleeping woman didn't require armed supervision, but he'd just shaken his head and said he slept better that way. She wondered if he slept at all. The storm raged for hours, and somewhere in the middle of it, Mara finally drifted off. Her dreams were uneasy, images of knives and soot and Margaret Garrett's cold smile. But they didn't last. Whenever the nightmare threatened to overwhelm her, she felt a presence at the edge of her consciousness. A voice, maybe, or just a feeling, something that whispered stay and safe and not alone. When she woke, the storm had passed and pale morning light was filtering through the window. She could smell coffee brewing, could hear Luke moving around in the other room, and for one perfect moment, she allowed herself to forget everything that had brought her to this place. For one perfect moment, she was just a woman waking up in a cabin in the mountains with nothing to fear and nowhere else to be. Then she remembered, and the moment shattered. But something of it lingered, a residue of peace, of possibility, as she rose and dressed and went to face another day. 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, the message arrived. Luke found it nailed to the fence post at the edge of his property, a single sheet of paper weighted down with a stone. The handwriting was elegant, feminine, Margaret Garrett's, if Mara had to guess, and the words were simple and direct. Return what belongs to us, or suffer the consequences. He brought it back to the cabin and set it on the table without comment. Mara read it once, twice, 3 times, as if repetition might change its meaning. They know where I am, she said finally. They've probably known since the day I brought you here. Marcus Garrett has eyes everywhere. Luke sat down across from her, his expression grim. This is just their way of making it official, putting us on notice. What do we do? Nothing's changed. We prepare, we stay alert, we don't give them an easy opportunity. He reached across the table and took the paper from her hands, crumpling it into a ball. They're trying to scare us. That's all this is. A warning shot. And if it's more than that, then we deal with it when it happens. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust in his confidence, his competence, his steady certainty that they could handle whatever came. But she'd lived under the Garrett's shadow for too long to underestimate them. They won't stop, she said quietly. You know that, don't you? They'll keep pushing, keep threatening, until they get what they want. And what they want is me, broken and bleeding, paying for a crime I didn't commit. Then they'll have to come through me first. That's exactly what I'm afraid of. She looked up, meeting his eyes. I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me. If they hurt you or killed you or… Mara. He cut her off, his voice gentle but firm. I made my choice that day in the alley. I knew what I was getting into, and I did it anyway. Whatever happens next, that's not on you. It's on them. But no. He reached across the table and took her hand, his fingers warm and rough against her skin. I've spent my whole life watching other people suffer because I was too afraid to act. I'm not going to do that anymore. Especially not with you. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither of them was ready to fully acknowledge. What do you mean? Mara asked slowly. Especially not with me. Luke was quiet for a long moment. She could see him wrestling with something, some internal battle between caution and honesty. And she waited, hardly breathing, for him to reach a decision. When I first saw you in that alley, he said finally, you reminded me of someone. That woman I told you about, the one I helped escape all those years ago. You had the same look in your eyes, this terrible, resigned acceptance, like you'd already decided that fighting was pointless. It felt pointless. I know, but here's the thing. He tightened his grip on her hand, his gray eyes burning into hers. You didn't give up. Even when they had you on your knees, even when they were cutting away everything that made you feel human, some part of you was still fighting. I could see it, and that's when I knew I couldn't walk away. Because you saw yourself in me. Because I saw what I could have been, if someone had helped me when I needed it. His voice went rough. I spent years being the kind of person who let bad things happen, let my mother die, let innocent people suffer, told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that there was nothing I could do. But that was a lie. There's always something you can do, you just have to be willing to do it. Mara stared at him, this man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. This man who carried his own wounds with such quiet dignity, who had built a sanctuary in the wilderness and offered it to a stranger without hesitation. You're not the person you used to be, she said softly. Maybe not, but I'm not sure I've figured out who I am now. He released her hand and sat back, some of the intensity fading from his expression. All I know is that when I look at you, I don't see a burden or a problem to be solved. I see someone worth fighting for, someone worth protecting. Even if it costs you everything? Even then, she wanted to argue, wanted to tell him that she wasn't worth the risk, that he should have left her in that alley and gone on with his quiet, solitary life. But the words wouldn't come, because the truth was she didn't want him to leave her, didn't want to face whatever came next alone. And maybe that was selfish, probably it was, but after everything she'd been through, she thought she'd earned a little selfishness. All right, she said finally. All right. All right, what? All right, we do this together. Whatever comes, whatever happens, we face it as a team. She squared her shoulders, feeling something harden in her chest. Not fear, but determination. But I'm not going to sit back and let you fight my battles for me. If the Garretts want a war, they're going to get one, from both of us. Luke studied her for a moment, then slowly, unexpectedly, smiled. It transformed his face, softened the hard lines, warmed the storm-gray eyes, and Mara felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. That's what I was hoping you'd say. The next morning, riders appeared on the ridge. Mara saw them first, 4 dark shapes silhouetted against the early light, sitting motionless on their horses as if they'd been there for hours. She was at the well, drawing water for the day, when some instinct made her look up. The bucket slipped from her hands and hit the ground with a thud she barely heard. "Luke!" Her voice came out strangled. "Luke!" He emerged from the barn at a run, rifle already in his hands. His eyes followed her pointing finger to the ridge, and she saw his jaw tighten. "Get inside," he said. "No." The word surprised them both. "I'm not hiding. Not anymore." "Mara, you said we were a team. You said we'd face this together." She met his eyes, her chin lifted in defiance of the fear clawing at her chest. "Did you mean it, or were those just words?" For a heartbeat, she thought he would argue. Then something shifted in his expression, recognition, maybe, or respect, and he nodded. "Stay close. Don't do anything unless I tell you to." They stood together in the yard, watching the riders descend from the ridge. As they drew closer, Mara could make out individual faces. The youngest Garrett's son, Jacob, who'd held the knife in the alley. 2 men she didn't recognize, rough-looking types with the dead eyes of hired muscle. And at the head of the group, Marcus Garrett himself. He reined in his horse about 30 feet away, surveying the ranch with the proprietary gaze of a man who believed everything he saw was already his. "Barrett," his voice carried across the distance, cold and commanding. "You've got something that belongs to me." "I don't have anything of yours, Garrett." Luke's voice was just as cold. "Never did. Never will." "That woman beside you says otherwise." Marcus's eyes slid to Mara, and she felt her skin crawl. "She was my son's wife, my property, by law and by right. You had no authority to remove her from our custody." "Your custody." Luke let the words hang in the air. "Is that what you call holding a woman prisoner for 6 months? Torturing her in the middle of the street? Cutting her hair like she was livestock being marked for slaughter? She killed my son. She needed to be punished." "Your son died of fever. Everyone in Bitter Creek knows it. The only crime she committed was being unlucky enough to marry into your family." Marcus's face darkened. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Luke took a step forward, and Mara saw the hired men's hands move toward their weapons. "I've been in this territory for 8 years, Garrett. Long enough to hear the stories, long enough to know exactly what kind of man you are. And what kind is that? The kind who destroys anyone who gets in his way. The kind who uses power like a weapon and calls it justice. The kind who teaches his sons that women are property and kindness is weakness." Luke's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. "The kind of man I've spent my whole life trying not to become." Silence fell over the yard. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Then Marcus Garrett laughed. It was a harsh, ugly sound, full of contempt and absolute confidence. "Pretty speech, but speeches don't change facts. That woman belongs to us. If you don't hand her over, we'll take her by force, and we'll burn this ranch to the ground while we're at it." "You're welcome to try." Luke raised the rifle, not quite pointing it at anyone, but making its presence impossible to ignore. "But I should warn you, I've killed men before. Better men than you. If you set foot on my property with hostile intent, I won't hesitate to add to that count." The moment stretched, taut as a wire about to snap. Mara stood frozen, her heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. She could see Jacob's hand trembling on his gun belt, could see the hired men exchanging uncertain glances. They hadn't expected this. They'd expected Luke to fold, to hand her over to save his own skin. They'd underestimated him. Finally, Marcus jerked his horse's head around. "This isn't over, Barrett. Not by a long shot. I'll be back, with more men, more guns, and a legal warrant for her arrest. And when that happens, all your threats won't amount to a hill of beans." Looking forward to it. The riders turned and headed back toward the ridge, and Mara didn't let herself breathe until they disappeared over the crest. Then her legs gave out. Luke caught her before she hit the ground, his arms strong and steady around her. "Easy, easy. It's okay. They're gone." "They'll come back." Her voice was shaking. "You heard him. They'll come back with more people, with the law on their side. Let them try." He helped her stand, keeping one hand on her arm for support. "We've got time to prepare, and we've got something they don't." "What's that?" He met her eyes, and despite everything, Despite the fear, the uncertainty, the shadow of violence hanging over them both, he smiled. Each other. Mara stared at him for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It came out ragged and tear-stained, closer to a sob than genuine mirth, but it was still a laugh. "You're insane," she said. "You know that, right? Absolutely, completely insane." "Probably." He released her arm but didn't step away. "Does that change anything?" She thought about it, really thought about it, considering everything she knew, everything she felt, everything she feared and hoped and didn't dare to want. "No," she said finally. "I suppose it doesn't." They stood together in the morning light, watching the ridge where their enemies had disappeared, and waited for whatever came next. The days that followed the confrontation took on a strange, suspended quality, as if the whole ranch was holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Luke reinforced the fences, stockpiled ammunition, mapped out escape routes through the back country that Mara memorized until she could run them in her sleep. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, speaking little, their silence filled with the unspoken weight of everything that hung between them. Mara found herself watching him when she thought he wasn't looking. The way he moved, efficient, purposeful, every action deliberate and controlled. The way his hands worked the leather of a bridle or the stock of a rifle, confident and sure. The way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon, never quite relaxing, never quite letting his guard down. He'd been doing this for years, she realized, living on the edge of violence, waiting for threats that might never come. And now, because of her, that vigilance had become something more than habit. It had become necessity. "You don't have to do this," she said one evening, watching him oil the rifle by lamplight. "You could put me on a horse, point me toward the mountains, let me disappear. They'd have no reason to come after you then." Luke didn't look up from his work. "Is that what you want?" "What I want doesn't matter. What matters is, it matters to me." Now he did look up, his gray eyes finding hers in the flickering light. "What you want matters. So I'll ask you again, is that what you want? To run? To spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering if today's the day they finally catch up?" She thought about it, really thought about it, turning the question over in her mind like a stone smoothed by years of water. "No," she said finally. "That's not what I want." "Then stop talking about leaving." He went back to his work, his voice gruff but not unkind. "We've been over this. We face it together or not at all." Mara opened her mouth to argue, then closed it again. There was no point. He'd made up his mind that first day in the alley, and nothing she said was going to change it. Part of her, the part that had learned to expect betrayal, to anticipate abandonment, still couldn't quite believe it was real. People didn't sacrifice for others. Not in her experience. They took what they wanted and left the wreckage for someone else to clean up. But Luke was different. Luke was something she'd never encountered before. A man who saw her, truly saw her, and decided she was worth fighting for anyway. It terrified her more than the Garretts ever could. The storm rolled in 3 days later, coming down from the mountains with a fury that rattled the windows and turned the sky the color of bruises. Luke brought the horses into the barn, secured everything that could be secured, and they hunkered down in the cabin to wait it out. The first clap of thunder made Mara jump, her hand flying instinctively to her chest. Luke noticed. Of course he noticed. He noticed everything, but he didn't comment, just moved to the wood stove and stirred the coals higher, filling the small space with warmth. "Storms bother you?" he asked, his back still turned. "They used to comfort me. When I was a girl, I'd sit by the window and watch the lightning, counting the seconds between flash and thunder." She wrapped her arms around herself, remembering. "My mother said it was dangerous, that I should be in bed, hiding under the covers like a sensible person. But I couldn't help it. There was something about all that power, all that wildness, that made me feel alive. And now? Now they remind me of the night Samuel died." The words came out before she could stop them. "There was a storm that night, too. The worst one of the season. I sat beside his bed and listened to the thunder, and I thought if the lightning could just strike the house, just burn everything to the ground, at least it would be over. At least I wouldn't have to watch him suffer anymore." She heard Luke set down the poker, heard his footsteps cross the floor. And then his hand was on her shoulder, warm and steady, anchoring her to the present. "It wasn't your fault," he said quietly. "What happened to him? What happened after? None of it was your fault. I know that. In my head, I know that." She turned to face him, her eyes burning with tears she refused to let fall. "But in my heart, sometimes I wonder if they were right, if I could have done more, if I could have saved him somehow, if I just tried harder." "Stop." His voice was gentle but firm. "I've seen people die, Mara, more than I want to remember. And I've learned that there are some things you just can't fix, no matter how hard you try. Some people are going to die no matter what you do. The only choice you have is whether you let it destroy you too." "Is that what you did? With your mother?" The question hung between them, intimate and dangerous. For a long moment, Luke didn't answer. She could see him wrestling with something, some old wound that had never quite healed. "My mother's death did destroy me," he said finally. "For a long time. I became the kind of person who didn't care about anything. Not myself, not others, not right or wrong. I told myself it was strength, that feeling nothing was better than feeling everything. But it was just another kind of dying." "What changed?" "I met someone who showed me a different way." His hand tightened on her shoulder, then released. "That woman I helped escape, she didn't just need my help. She needed someone to believe she deserved help. And watching her fight for her life, watching her refuse to give up even when everything was against her, it woke something in me. Something I thought had died a long time ago. Hope? Maybe. Or maybe just the ability to care about someone other than myself." He stepped back, his expression unreadable. "When I walked into that alley and saw you, I felt the same thing. Like I was being given a second chance. A chance to be the person I should have been all along." The storm raged outside, wind howling around the cabin, rain hammering against the roof. But inside, in the small circle of warmth and light, something shifted between them. Some barrier that had been carefully maintained began to crack. "Luke," Mara said softly, "I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. But I need you to know, whatever comes, I'm grateful for everything you've done, for everything you are. Don't be grateful yet." His voice was rough. "We haven't won anything." "That's not what I mean." She stepped closer, close enough to see the pulse jumping in his throat. "I mean, I'm grateful that I met you, that out of all the people in that town, you were the one who stepped forward, that you saw something in me worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." He stared at her for a long moment, his gray eyes dark with something she couldn't quite name. Then, slowly, he reached up and touched her face. His fingers were rough from work, calloused and scarred, but his touch was infinitely gentle. He traced the line of her cheekbone, the curve of her jaw, the corner of her mouth, where the cut from Marcus's slap had long since healed. "You were always worth saving," he said quietly. "You just needed someone to remind you." The space between them disappeared. She didn't know who moved first, maybe both of them, drawn together by a gravity that had been building since that first moment in the alley. His lips found hers, tentative at first, questioning. When she didn't pull away, the kiss deepened, and she felt something inside her break open. All the walls she'd built, all the careful defenses, crumbling in the face of this unexpected tenderness. They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in each other's arms while the storm raged outside. When they finally broke apart, Mara's eyes were wet and Luke's hands were shaking. "I didn't plan for this," he said. "Neither did I." "It complicates things." "Everything's already complicated." She reached up and touched his face, mirroring his gesture from moments before. "What's one more complication?" He laughed, a short, surprised sound, as if laughter was something he'd forgotten how to do. "You're not wrong." "I rarely am." The levity broke the tension, and they stepped apart, both of them aware that something fundamental had changed. The easy partnership of the past weeks had become something else, something deeper, more dangerous, infinitely more precious. "We should sleep," Luke said finally. Tomorrow we face whatever comes." She met his eyes steadily. "Together." He nodded, and this time the word carried a weight it hadn't before. "Together." The storm passed in the night, leaving the ranch washed clean and shining under a morning sky so blue it hurt to look at. Mara stepped outside to find Luke already working, clearing branches that had fallen during the worst of the wind, his movements as efficient and purposeful as always. But something was different. When he looked up and saw her standing on the porch, a smile flickered across his face. Small, almost shy, as if he wasn't sure he was allowed to show it. She smiled back, and for one perfect moment, the shadow of the Garretts seemed very far away. Then, reality crashed back in. The rider appeared on the eastern trail, coming fast, his horse lathered and blowing. Luke dropped the branch he was carrying and reached for the rifle that was never far from his side, but Mara recognized the horse before she recognized the man. "Wait," she said. "Colt, I think I know him." The rider reined in hard, his horse skidding on the wet grass. He was young, maybe 20, with a thin face and anxious eyes, and he wore the rough clothes of a working man, not the finery of the Garrett family or their hired guns. "You're the Barrett place?" he asked, his voice breathless. "Who's asking?" Luke kept the rifle ready but didn't raise it. "My name's Tom Reeves. I work at the general store in Bitter Creek, or I did, until yesterday." The young man swallowed hard. "I'm looking for the woman, Mara Hale. If she's here, she needs to know. They're coming. Tomorrow morning, first light. Marcus Garrett, his men, and Sheriff Dawson with a warrant for her arrest." Mara felt the blood drain from her face. "A warrant? On what grounds?" "Murder." Tom's voice cracked on the word. "They got a judge to sign off on it. Say you poisoned Samuel Garrett, made it look like fever. They're calling it premeditated, ma'am. Hanging offense." The world seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Murder. They were accusing her of murder. And not just the vague whispers and accusations of the past 6 months. This was official, legal. A warrant with a judge's signature, carrying the full weight of territorial law. "That's a lie," she whispered. I would never." "I know, ma'am. That's why I'm here." Tom dismounted clumsily, nearly falling in his haste. "I saw what they did to you in the alley, saw you kneeling there while they cut your hair and nobody lifted a finger, and I did nothing, just stood there like everybody else." "Why come now?" Luke's voice was sharp, suspicious. "Because I can't live with myself anymore. Because my mother raised me to know right from wrong, and watching that woman suffer while I stayed silent is wrong." Tom met Luke's eyes directly. "I know I'm not much, can't shoot worth a damn, can't fight, but I can ride fast and I can tell the truth. Figured that was worth something." Luke studied him for a long moment, then slowly lowered the rifle. "How many men is Garrett bringing?" 12, maybe 15, plus the sheriff and 2 deputies. They're planning to hit the ranch at dawn before you have time to prepare." "They've been watching the roads?" "Got men on every trail between here and town. I came through the back country, over the ridge. Nearly killed my horse doing it." Tom glanced at the exhausted animal, guilt flickering across his face. "I'm sorry. I know it's not enough. Nothing's enough. But it's all I've got." Mara stepped forward, her heart full of something she couldn't quite name. "It's more than anyone else has given me. Thank you, Tom." The young man flushed and looked away. "Don't thank me yet, ma'am. You're still in a world of trouble." "At least now we know it's coming." Luke moved to stand beside Mara, his presence solid and reassuring. "Tom, can you make it back to town without being seen?" "I think so. Same way I came." "Good. When you get there, I want you to find someone. A man named Henry Whitmore. He runs the telegraph office. Tell him Luke Barrett needs a message sent to Fort Laramie, addressed to Captain James Hollister. Tell him it's about the Garrett family, and it's urgent." Tom nodded, committing the names to memory. "What should the message say?" "Hollister will know what it means." Luke's jaw tightened. "We served together a long time ago. He owes me a favor. It's time to collect." Mara looked at him sharply, another piece of his past emerging unexpectedly. She filed it away for later when there was time for questions. "Go," Luke said, "fast as you can. And Tom—" The young man paused, one foot in the stirrup. "Thank you for having the courage to do what's right." Tom nodded once, mounted his exhausted horse, and rode for the ridge. They watched him until he disappeared over the crest. Then Luke turned to Mara with an expression she'd never seen before. Fear. He was afraid. He was not for himself, she realized, for her. We don't have much time, he said. If they're coming at dawn tomorrow, we've got less than 20 hours to prepare. Prepare how? You said yourself we can't fight 15 armed men. We don't have to fight them. We just have to survive long enough for help to arrive. He was already moving toward the barn, his mind clearly racing through possibilities. The cabin's defensible, but not against a determined assault. We'd be trapped, outnumbered, outgunned. So what do? We don't stay in the cabin. He turned to face her, his eyes bright with sudden intensity. There's a place in the back country, a box canyon about 2 miles from here. Rock walls on 3 sides, only one way in or out. I found it years ago, kept it in mind in case I ever needed somewhere to make a stand. You've been planning for something like this? I've been planning for something like this since I built the ranch. He took her hands in his grip tight. I'm not going to let them take you, Mara. I don't care how many men they bring, how many warrants they wave around. You're not a murderer, and I'm not going to let them hang you for a crime you didn't commit. Even if it means dying? The question hung between them, stark and brutal. Even then, he raised her hands to his lips and kissed them gently. But I don't plan on dying. I plan on fighting, and I plan on winning. Mara stared at him, this man who had become everything to her in the space of a few short weeks. The fear was still there, cold and coiling in her stomach, but beneath it, she felt something else stirring. Determination. She had spent her whole life being pushed around. By her father, by the Garretts, by a world that told her she was worthless and expected her to believe it. She had accepted abuse and injustice because she thought she had no other choice. But she did have a choice. She'd always had a choice. And right now, standing in the yard of a ranch that had become her sanctuary, holding the hands of a man who had saved her life and stolen her heart, she chose to fight. Tell me what to do, she said. Luke smiled, not the small, hesitant smile of the morning, but something fiercer, something wild. Come with me. They spent the day preparing. Luke led her through the back country, following trails that didn't seem to exist until he pointed them out, climbing through terrain that would have been impassable to anyone who didn't know exactly where they were going. The box canyon was everything he'd promised, a natural fortress with sheer rock walls rising 50 feet on 3 sides and a narrow entrance that could be defended by a handful of determined fighters. They'll have the numbers, Luke explained, walking her through the space, but we'll have the position. If we can hold that entrance, they won't be able to flank us. And if they decide to wait us out, that's where Hollister comes in. If the message gets through, he'll bring soldiers. Federal authority trumps territorial warrants. The Garretts have influence, but they don't have the power to override the United States Army. If the message gets through. Mara felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. That's a lot of ifs, Luke. I know. He turned to face her, his expression grave. I'm not going to lie to you, Mara. This could go wrong 100 different ways. We could die here tomorrow. That's the truth. I know. If you want to run, if you want to take a horse and ride for the mountains, try to disappear, I won't stop you. I'll hold them here as long as I can. Give you a head start. It might be enough. And leave you alone to face them? She shook her head firmly. No. We've been over this. Whatever happens, we face it together. Even if together means dying together? She stepped closer to him, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from his body. I'd rather die standing beside you than live running alone. That's my choice. That's my answer. And I'm not going to change it. He looked at her for a long moment, something working behind his eyes. Then he pulled her into his arms and held her tight, his face buried in her ruined hair. I don't deserve you, he murmured. Maybe not, she smiled against his chest. But you've got me anyway. They returned to the ranch as the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The beauty of it felt almost obscene given what was coming, as if the world should know better than to put on such a display when people were about to die. Luke packed supplies, food, water, ammunition, blankets, while Mara checked and loaded every weapon she could find. Her hands were steady, she noticed with distant surprise. Whatever fear she felt had been transmuted into something else, something colder, harder, more useful. "There's something else," Luke said as they finished their preparations. "Something I need to tell you before tomorrow." She looked up from the rifle she was loading. "What is it?" He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A ring, she realized. Plain silver, worn smooth with age. "This was my mother's," he said quietly. "My father gave it to her the day they were married. After she died, I kept it. Told myself it was the only good thing left of her." Mara's breath caught in her throat. "Luke, I know this isn't the time. I know we might not have a future. But if we die tomorrow, I want to die knowing I said the words." He took her hand and slipped the ring onto her finger. "Mara Hale, I love you. I've loved you since the moment I saw you kneeling in that alley, refusing to break no matter what they did to you. And whatever happens next, I want you to know that." Tears spilled down her cheeks, warm and salt. "I love you too. I think I have from the beginning, even when I didn't know what to call it. Then no matter what happens tomorrow, we've already won." He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed the ring. "They can take everything else, but they can't take this." The night passed in a blur of preparation and stolen moments. They lay together on the narrow bed, not sleeping, just holding each other and watching the moonlight creep across the floor. When the first gray light of dawn began to show through the window, they rose without speaking and gathered their things. The ride to the box canyon took less than an hour. Luke had scouted the route so many times he could have done it blindfolded, and they arrived with the sun still low on the horizon. He positioned their horses at the back of the canyon, near a small spring that would provide water, then set about fortifying the entrance. Mara helped where she could, stacking rocks to create cover, laying out ammunition, checking sight lines. Her hands were still steady. Her mind was clear. If this was going to be her last day on Earth, she was determined to face it with dignity. They heard the riders before they saw them. The sound came filtering through the rocks, hoofbeats, lots of them, moving slowly but steadily closer. Luke took his position behind the makeshift barricade, rifle ready, his face set in lines of grim determination. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "Don't shoot until they're well inside the entrance. We need every shot to count." "I remember. And if something happens to me, if I go down, don't try to help me. Just keep shooting, keep fighting. Don't give them an inch." She wanted to argue, to tell him that she would never leave him, that they would stand or fall together, but she understood why he was saying it, understood that sometimes love meant preparing for the worst, even while hoping for the best. "I won't let them take me," she said instead, "no matter what. I won't give them that satisfaction." He glanced at her, and something like pride flickered in his eyes. "I know you won't." The riders appeared at the canyon mouth. There were more of them than Tom had estimated, 20 at least, spread out in a loose formation that spoke of confidence and overwhelming force. At the front rode Marcus Garrett, flanked by his son Jacob and a man wearing a sheriff's star. Behind them came the hired guns, their faces hard and eager for violence. Marcus reined in his horse and surveyed the canyon entrance, his eyes narrowing as he took in the fortifications. "Barrett," he called out, "I know you're in there. I've got a warrant for the arrest of Mara Hale, signed by a territorial judge. Surrender her now, and I'll let you walk away." "That's a generous offer," Luke called back, "considering you're planning to hang an innocent woman." "She's not innocent. She murdered my son." "Your son died of fever. Everyone knows it. This warrant isn't justice. It's revenge." Marcus's face darkened. "Last chance, Barrett. Send her out, or we're coming in." "Then come." Luke's voice was steady, almost casual. "But I should warn you, this canyon has one way in and one way out, and I've got enough ammunition to make sure a lot of your men don't make it back." A murmur rippled through the riders. Some of them exchanged uneasy glances, clearly having second thoughts about the wisdom of assaulting a fortified position. "You're bluffing," Marcus said. "Only one way to find out." The standoff stretched, seconds feeling like hours. Mara kept her rifle trained on the entrance, her finger resting lightly on the trigger. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, could hear the blood rushing in her ears. But her hands didn't shake, her aim didn't waver. She was done being afraid. Marcus turned to confer with the sheriff, their voices too low to hear. Then he straightened in his saddle and raised his hand. Take them. The first wave came fast. 6 men on horseback, charging for the narrow entrance with guns blazing. Luke fired 3 times in rapid succession, and 3 saddles emptied. Mara squeezed her trigger and felt the rifle kick against her shoulder, saw a 4th man jerk and fall. The remaining 2 wheeled their horses and retreated, leaving their companions writhing in the dust. Hold your position, Luke shouted, already reloading. That was just the first wave. They'll try again. He was right. The second assault came moments later. More men this time, some on foot, using the rocks for cover. The canyon filled with the crack of gunfire, the smell of powder, the screams of wounded men. Mara lost track of time, lost track of everything except the rhythm of aim, fire, reload. Aim, fire, reload. A bullet whined past her ear, close enough to feel the heat. She ducked, pressed herself against the rocks, and kept shooting. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. By the time the Garretts called a retreat, the canyon entrance was littered with bodies, and the survivors had pulled back to regroup. "How many did we get?" Mara asked, her voice hoarse. 8, maybe 9. Hard to tell. Luke checked his ammunition, his face grim. "We're running low. Another assault like that, we won't have enough to hold them. What do we do?" Before he could answer, a new sound cut through the smoke and dust, a sound that made Mara's heart leap with sudden, desperate hope. A bugle call, clear and strong and unmistakable. They both turned toward the canyon mouth, watching as a column of blue-uniformed soldiers appeared on the ridge behind the Garrett forces. At their head rode a man with captain's bars on his shoulders and an expression of cold fury on his face. "James Hollister," Luke breathed. "The son of a bitch actually came." The next few minutes were chaos. The soldiers surrounded the Garrett men, disarming them with brutal efficiency. Captain Hollister rode forward, his eyes sweeping the scene with barely contained disgust. "Marcus Garrett," he called out. "By the authority of the United States Army, you and your men are under arrest for assault on federal land, attempted murder, and conspiracy to subvert territorial justice." "You have no authority here," Marcus sputtered. "This is a lawful arrest warrant." That warrant was obtained through fraud and intimidation, as I'm sure a federal judge will agree. Hollister dismounted and strode toward the canyon entrance, where Luke and Mara were emerging from their fortifications. "Barrett, you look like hell." "Feel like it too." Luke clasped the captain's hand, something like relief breaking through his exhaustion. "How did you get here so fast?" "I was already in the territory, got your message last night and rode through the dark." Hollister's gaze moved to Mara, softening slightly. "Mrs. Hale, I presume?" "Yes." Her voice came out barely above a whisper. "Thank you. I don't know how to—" "Don't thank me. Thank the man beside you. He saved my life once, long time ago. I've been waiting for the chance to return the favor." Hollister turned back to his men. "Get these prisoners secured. We're taking them to Fort Laramie to face federal charges." As the soldiers moved to comply, Mara felt her legs give way. Luke caught her, lowering her gently to the ground, his arms wrapped around her like he never intended to let go. "It's over," she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. "It's really over." "Not quite." His voice was rough with emotion. "But the worst of it is, the rest we'll figure out together." She looked up at him, this man who had walked into an alley and changed everything, who had fought beside her and loved her and refused to give up even when all hope seemed lost. "Together," she repeated. And for the first time in longer than she could remember, she smiled. The ride back to the ranch felt like waking from a dream. Mara sat in front of Luke on his horse, her body pressed against his chest, his arm wrapped securely around her waist. The morning sun warmed her face, and the air smelled of pine and sage and something else, something that might have been freedom. Behind them, Captain Hollister's soldiers escorted the Garrett prisoners toward Fort Laramie. Marcus rode in the middle of the column, his wrists bound, his face a mask of impotent fury. He'd tried to argue, tried to invoke his connections, his influence, his power. But Hollister had simply looked at him with those cold blue eyes and said, "Save it for the judge." Mara had watched Marcus Garrett, the man who had tormented her for 6 months, who had orchestrated her public humiliation, who had tried to have her hanged for a crime she didn't commit, reduced to nothing more than another prisoner. And she'd felt nothing. No satisfaction, no triumph, no vindictive pleasure. Just relief, just exhaustion, just a bone-deep weariness that made her want to sleep for 100 years. "You're quiet," Luke said, his breath warm against her ear. "I'm tired." "That's not what I meant." She was silent for a moment, trying to find the words for what she was feeling. "I thought I would be happy," she said finally, "when they took him away. I thought I would feel something. Joy, maybe, or at least satisfaction. But I just feel empty." "That's normal." His arm tightened around her waist. "You've been running on fear and adrenaline for weeks. Now that it's over, there's nothing left to feel. Will it always be like this?" "No." He pressed a kiss to her temple, gentle and reassuring. "The feelings will come back, the good ones and the bad ones. But for now, it's okay to just be tired. It's okay to rest." The ranch came into view as they crested the final ridge, and Mara felt tears prick at her eyes. The cabin, the barn, the corrals with their peacefully grazing horses, it all looked exactly as they'd left it, untouched by the violence that had nearly destroyed them both. "Home," she thought. "This is home now." Luke helped her dismount, then led the horse to the barn while she stood in the yard, simply breathing. The sun was higher now, the air warming toward midday, and somewhere in the distance, a bird was singing. Such an ordinary sound. Such an ordinary day. Except nothing about it was ordinary at all. She heard Luke's footsteps returning and turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe. Or love. Or some complicated mixture of both. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I will, but first—" He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Hollister gave me this before he left. It's a formal declaration clearing your name of all charges related to Samuel Garrett's death. Signed by a federal judge, witnessed by an Army captain. The Garretts can't touch you now. Not legally, not ever." Mara took the paper with trembling hands. The words blurred before her eyes, but she didn't need to read them to understand what they meant. She was free, truly, finally, irrevocably free. "Luke, there's more." He took a deep breath as if steadying himself. "Hollister also told me that the Garrett family's assets are likely to be seized. Their ranch, their cattle, their mining interests, all of it. Evidence of fraud, coercion, and conspiracy going back decades. By the time the federal courts are done, there won't be anything left." "Their empire," Mara whispered. "Everything they built. Built on the backs of people they destroyed. People like you." His jaw tightened. "It's justice, Mara. Long overdue, but justice all the same." She should have felt something at that news too. Satisfaction, maybe, or vindication. But all she felt was tired. So terribly, terribly tired. "Come inside," Luke said gently. "You need to rest." She let him lead her into the cabin, let him help her remove her boots and settle onto the bed. The sheets still smelled faintly of gunpowder from the clothes they'd worn during the siege, but underneath that was the familiar scent of the ranch, leather and wood smoke, and something indefinably Luke. He moved to leave, but she caught his hand. "Stay," she said. "Please." He hesitated for only a moment. Then he kicked off his own boots and lay down beside her, pulling her close against his chest. His heartbeat was steady beneath her ear, strong and sure, and she focused on that rhythm as sleep began to pull her under. "I love you," she murmured, the words slurring with exhaustion. "I love you too." His arms tightened around her. "Now sleep. I'll be here when you wake up." She believed him. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she believed that someone would still be there when she opened her eyes. And with that belief warming her chest like a small, steady flame, Mara Hale finally let herself rest. She slept for nearly 2 days. Luke watched over her, leaving her side only when absolutely necessary, to tend the animals, to prepare food she might not eat, to stand on the porch and scan the horizon for threats that were no longer coming. He'd spent so long in a state of constant vigilance that he didn't quite know how to stop, how to convince his body that the danger had passed. But every time he looked at Mara, at the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing, at the new growth of hair softening the harsh lines of her skull, at the way her hand instinctively reached for him even in sleep. He felt something loosen in his chest. They had survived. Against all odds, against an enemy that should have crushed them, they had survived. On the morning of the third day, Mara woke to find Luke sitting in the chair beside the bed, a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. The light filtering through the window was soft and golden, and for a long moment she simply lay there, watching the dust motes drift through the air. "How long?" she asked, her voice rusty with disuse. 2 days? Almost 3. He set down the coffee and moved to sit on the edge of the bed. "How do you feel?" She considered the question carefully, taking inventory of her body, her mind, her heart. The exhaustion was still there, lurking at the edges, but it was different now, the healthy tiredness of recovery rather than the desperate depletion of survival. "Better," she said. "I feel better." "Good." He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "There's food if you're hungry. Nothing fancy, but it's warm." In a minute, she caught his hand and held it against her cheek. "First, tell me something." "What?" "Tell me this is real. Tell me I'm not going to wake up back in that house, back in that alley, back in any of the places I've been trying so hard to escape." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Tell me this is really happening." Luke leaned forward and kissed her forehead, her eyelids, the tip of her nose. "This is real," he said softly. "Every moment of it. The good parts and the hard parts, and everything in between. And I know it doesn't feel real yet. I know part of you is still waiting for the other shoe to drop, but it will. Eventually, it will." "How do you know?" "Because I've been where you are. I spent years looking over my shoulder, waiting for my past to catch up with me. And then one day, I realized it already had, and I'd survived it." He pulled back to meet her eyes. "That's what today is, Mara. The beginning of after. The start of whatever comes next." She stared at him for a long moment, letting his words sink in. The beginning of after. She'd spent so long focused on survival, on getting through each day without being destroyed, that she'd never really thought about what might come after. What a life without fear might look like. What she might want, if wanting was suddenly allowed. "I don't know how to do this," she admitted. "I don't know how to be happy. I don't know how to be normal." "Neither do I." He smiled, and it transformed his face, softened the hard lines, warmed the storm-gray eyes. "But maybe we can figure it out together." Together. That word again, the one that had become their touchstone, their promise to each other and themselves. "I'd like that," she said. They ate breakfast together at the rough-hewn table, and Mara discovered that she was ravenously hungry. Hungrier than she'd been in months, maybe years. Luke had made eggs and biscuits and bacon, simple food that tasted like heaven, and she ate until her stomach ached and then kept eating anyway. "Slow down," Luke said, watching her with a mixture of amusement and concern. "The food's not going anywhere." "I know, She paused, a forkful of eggs halfway to her mouth. "I can't remember the last time I ate because I wanted to, instead of because I had to. Does that make sense?" "More than you know." After breakfast, she insisted on helping with the chores. Not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Because moving her body, doing something useful, felt like the first step toward reclaiming a life that had been stolen from her. They worked side by side through the morning, falling into an easy rhythm that required no words. Luke showed her how to mend a fence post, how to check a horse's hooves for stones, how to read the weather in the shape of the clouds. And Mara absorbed it all, hungry for knowledge, hungry for competence, hungry for everything that had been denied her. By noon, they were both sweating in the warmth of the day, and Luke called a halt. "That's enough for now. We don't have to do everything at once." "I know." Mara wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "But it feels good. Being useful. Being capable." "You were always capable. You just never had the chance to show it." She looked at him, really looked at him, taking in the familiar planes of his face, the quiet strength in his stance, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. This man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up instead of pushing her down. This man who had taught her that she was worth fighting for. "Luke," she said slowly, "what happens now?" "What do you mean?" "I mean us. The ranch. Everything." She gestured at the land around them, the cabin, the mountains rising in the distance. "We've been so focused on surviving that we never talked about what comes after, what we want, what we're building toward." He was quiet for a moment, considering. "What do you want?" The question caught her off guard. Nobody had ever asked her that before. Not her father, not Samuel, certainly not the Garretts. Her wants had never mattered to anyone, least of all herself. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never been allowed to want anything." "Then maybe it's time to start figuring it out." He took her hand and led her to the porch, where they sat on the steps and looked out at the land stretching before them. The mountains were purple in the distance, and the grass rippled in the breeze like waves on a green sea. Somewhere out there, the world was going on. People buying and selling, fighting and loving, living and dying. But here, in this small corner of existence, there was only peace. "When I first came here," Luke said, "I wasn't looking for anything except a place to hide. Somewhere I could disappear, forget who I'd been, pretend the past didn't exist." He paused, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. "But you can't outrun yourself. Eventually, everything catches up with you. And when it does, you have to decide what kind of person you want to be." "What did you decide?" "That I was tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of being alone." He turned to face her, his gray eyes intense. "And then you came along. And suddenly being alone wasn't just lonely anymore. It was unbearable." Mara felt tears prick at her eyes again. She seemed to be crying a lot lately. Not from sadness, but from an overflow of emotion she didn't know how to contain. "I never expected this," she said. "When you pulled me out of that alley, I thought, I don't know what I thought, that you'd leave me somewhere safe and disappear, that you'd get tired of dealing with my problems, that you'd realize I wasn't worth the trouble. And instead you stayed. You fought for me. You made me believe that maybe, just maybe, I deserve to be fought for." She squeezed his hand tightly. "I don't know what I want yet, but I know I want it to be with you, whatever it is, wherever it leads." Luke lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, one by one. "Then that's where we start." The days that followed were quiet, unhurried, filled with the small rituals of ordinary life. They worked the ranch together, ate meals together, fell asleep in each other's arms, and woke tangled in the sheets. They talked, really talked, about their pasts, their fears, their hopes for a future that suddenly seemed possible. Mara learned things about Luke she'd never known. The details of his childhood, growing up in a house ruled by fear. The years he'd spent after leaving, doing work he wasn't proud of, becoming someone he barely recognized. The woman he'd helped escape, and how that act of courage had set him on the path to redemption. And she told him things, too. About her father, the gambler who'd sold her future to pay his debts. About Samuel, the hollow man who'd never learned how to be real. About the 6 months in the Garrett house, surviving on nothing but stubbornness and the faint, desperate hope that someday it would be over. With each confession, each shared wound, the connection between them deepened. Not the desperate bond of survival, though that was there too, but something quieter, stronger. Something that felt like it could last. 2 weeks after the siege, a letter arrived. Luke found it tucked into the fence post at the edge of their property, left by a writer they'd never seen. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the contents made Mara's breath catch in her throat. "It's from Tom Reeves," she said, scanning the words. "The young man who warned us." "What does it say?" She read it aloud, her voice catching on certain phrases. "Mrs. Hale, I hope this letter finds you well. I've been following the news from Fort Laramie, and I wanted you to know that Marcus Garrett has been convicted on all charges. He'll spend the rest of his life in federal prison. His wife Margaret and their son Jacob received lesser sentences, but will be gone for many years as well. The ranch has been seized, as expected. The federal government is planning to sell it off piece by piece, and much of the proceeds will go to compensate those the Garretts wronged over the years. But here's the thing I really wanted to tell you. Bitter Creek is changing. With the Garretts gone, people are finally speaking up about what they saw, what they knew, what they were too afraid to say. Your story has become something of a rallying cry, proof that even the most powerful can be brought to justice if someone is willing to stand up. I know it doesn't undo what happened to you. Nothing can undo that. But I thought you might want to know that your suffering meant something, that it changed things, even if you never meant it to. I'm leaving Bitter Creek next week. Got a job lined up in Denver, working at a newspaper. Turns out the skills I learned keeping track of store inventory translate pretty well to keeping track of stories. Who knew? Take care of yourself, Mrs. Hale, and take care of Mr. Barrett, too. He's a good man, better than most of us deserve. With respect, Tom Reeves. Mara lowered the letter, her hands trembling slightly. A rallying cry, she repeated. He called my story a rallying cry. He's right. Luke moved to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. What happened to you, what you survived? It matters. Not just to us, but to everyone who was too scared to speak up. I didn't mean for it to matter. I just wanted to survive. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes survival itself is an act of defiance. He wrapped his arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. You didn't just survive, Mara. You proved that it's possible. That even when everything seems hopeless, there's still a chance. She leaned into him, letting his warmth anchor her. The letter had stirred up feelings she'd thought she'd put to rest. Memories of the alley, the knife, the endless months of captivity. But there was something else there too, a sense of purpose she'd never expected to find. Her suffering had meant something, not because she'd chosen it, not because she'd asked for it, but because she'd refused to let it destroy her, and in refusing, she'd lit a spark that others could see. I want to write back to him, she said suddenly. To Tom? Yes. I want to thank him, and I want to tell him. She paused, searching for the right words. I want to tell him that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being afraid and acting anyway. He thinks he was a coward for not helping me sooner, but he wasn't. He was just human. And when it mattered most, he found the strength to do the right thing. Luke smiled, that warm, soft smile that still made her heart flutter. That's a good thing to say. Will you help me write it? Of course. They went inside together, and Mara sat at the table with pen and paper while Luke busied himself making coffee. The words came slowly at first, then faster, pouring out of her like water through a broken dam. She wrote about fear and courage, about survival and hope, about the small acts of kindness that can change the world. And when she was done, she folded the letter carefully and set it aside to be posted. There, she said, it's finished. How do you feel? She considered the question, really considered it, the way she'd learned to do since coming to this place. Lighter, she said finally, like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and I just set it down. Good. Luke set a cup of coffee in front of her and took the chair across the table. That's good. They sat in comfortable silence, sipping their coffee, watching the afternoon light slant through the windows. Outside, the horses nickered softly, and a breeze stirred the curtains. It was such an ordinary moment, so simple, so peaceful, and yet it felt like everything Mara had ever wanted. Luke, she said slowly, I think I know what I want now. What's that? This. She gestured at the cabin, the ranch, the life they were building together. All of it. I want mornings like this, quiet and easy. I want to work the land and tend the animals and fall asleep knowing I'm safe. I want to grow old with you, watching the seasons change, watching our hair turn gray. That's a lot of wanting. I know, but you asked. She met his eyes, her gaze steady. What do you want? He reached across the table and took her hand. The same thing. Exactly the same thing. Then I guess we're in agreement. I guess we are. The smile that spread across his face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, warm and bright and full of promise. And Mara felt an answering smile rise to her own lips, felt something bloom in her chest that she'd almost forgotten how to name, happiness. This was what happiness felt like. There's one more thing, Luke said, his voice suddenly serious. What? He reached into his pocket and pulled out the ring, his mother's ring, the one he'd given her the night before the siege. She'd worn it every day since, feeling its slight weight on her finger like a promise. I gave you this because I thought we might die, he said, because I wanted you to know how I felt, even if we didn't have a future. But we do have a future now, and I want to give it to you again, properly this time. He slid off his chair and knelt beside her, the ring held between his fingers. Mara Hale, you are the strongest, bravest, most stubborn woman I've ever known. You've been through more than anyone should have to endure, and you came out the other side still standing, still fighting, still capable of love. His voice cracked slightly. I don't deserve you. I know that. But if you'll have me, if you'll let me spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of you, I promise I will never stop trying. Tears were streaming down her face, but she was smiling. Is that a proposal? It's more than that. It's a promise, a vow. Everything I have, everything I am, for as long as I live. He looked up at her, his gray eyes shining. Will you marry me, Mara? Properly this time, with witnesses and vows and everything that goes with it. She didn't have to think about her answer. It was already there, had been there since the moment he'd stepped into that alley and said 3 words that changed her life. Yes, she said. Yes, Luke Barrett, I'll marry you. He slid the ring onto her finger, the same ring, but somehow different now. Weightier, more real. And then he pulled her into his arms, and she buried her face in his shoulder, and they held each other while the afternoon light turned golden, and the coffee grew cold, and the world outside continued on without them. Later that evening, they sat on the porch and watched the stars come out, one by one, scattered across the darkening sky like promises. When should we do it? Mara asked. The wedding? Whenever you want, tomorrow, next week, next month. I don't care about the timing, I just care that it happens. I want it to be small, just us and a few witnesses, nothing fancy. That sounds perfect. She leaned against him, feeling his arm come up around her shoulders. And Luke? Yes? Thank you. For everything. For saving me. For loving me. For seeing me when I couldn't see myself. She turned to look at him, her eyes bright with tears that were no longer just for sorrow. You gave me my life back. I don't know how I'll ever repay you. You don't have to repay me. He kissed her forehead gently. Just be happy. That's all I've ever wanted. I think I can manage that. Good. He pulled her closer, and they sat together in the gathering darkness, watching the stars wheel overhead. Because I plan on making you happy for a very long time. The night settled around them, peaceful and still, and Mara felt the last of her fear finally, fully, let go. There would be challenges ahead, there always were, but she wasn't facing them alone anymore. She had Luke and the ranch, and a future that stretched out before her like a road she'd never dared to imagine. She had been broken once, shattered into 1,000 pieces by people who should have protected her. But she had put herself back together, piece by painful piece, with the help of a man who had refused to let her fall. And now, sitting on this porch in the mountains, wearing his mother's ring on her finger, she finally understood what it meant to be whole. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and golden, the kind of autumn day that seemed crafted specifically for new beginnings. Mara woke before sunrise, lying still in the darkness, listening to Luke's steady breathing beside her. In a few hours, everything would change. In a few hours, she would no longer be Mara Hale, the widow, the accused, the woman who had been broken in a dusty alley. She would be Mara Barrett, wife to a man who had taught her what it meant to be loved. The thought filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with the blankets piled on the bed. She slipped out from under Luke's arm and padded to the window, pulling the curtain aside to watch the first light creep over the mountains. The ranch spread out before her in shades of gray and gold, the barn, the corrals, the fences Luke had built with his own hands. Their home now. Their life. Behind her, she heard Luke stir. "You're up early," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "Couldn't sleep." She turned to face him, finding him propped on one elbow, watching her with those storm-gray eyes that still made her heart skip. Too much to think about. Having second thoughts? Never. She crossed back to the bed and sat on the edge, taking his hand in hers. I keep waiting for something to go wrong, for someone to show up and tell us we can't do this, that we don't deserve it. Luke sat up and cupped her face in his hands. Listen to me. We've fought for this, bled for it, nearly died for it. If anyone in this world deserves happiness, it's us. He kissed her forehead gently. No one's coming to take it away. I won't let them. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. I know that. It's just hard to believe sometimes, after everything. I know. He pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. But that's why we have each other. To remind ourselves that this is real, that we made it. They stayed like that for a long moment, holding each other in the growing light. Then Mara pulled back with a small laugh. We should get ready. The preacher's supposed to arrive by noon. The preacher can wait. Luke's eyes glinted with mischief. This is my last morning as an unmarried man. I intend to make the most of it. She swatted his shoulder, but she was smiling. Luke Barrett, we have guests coming. Just Tom Reeves and Captain Hollister. They'll understand. They'll understand that we made them ride all the way out here just to wait while we... He silenced her with a kiss, and for a while, the wedding preparations were forgotten entirely. By mid-morning, the ranch had transformed. Not through any elaborate decoration, Mara had insisted on keeping things simple, but through the subtle shift that happens when a space prepares to witness something sacred. The chairs from the cabin had been carried outside and arranged beneath the old cottonwood tree that shaded the yard. Wild flowers gathered from the meadow sat in jars on a makeshift altar. The mountains rose in the distance, purple and majestic, forming a backdrop that no cathedral could match. Mara stood in the bedroom, studying her reflection in the small mirror Luke had hung on the wall. The dress she wore was nothing fancy, a simple blue cotton she'd sewn herself over the past few weeks, but it fit her well, and the color brought out the green in her eyes. Her hair, still short but growing in soft waves now, had been pinned back with a silver comb. The comb had appeared on her pillow one morning 3 days after Luke's proposal. She'd found it wrapped in a scrap of cloth with a note in his careful handwriting. For when it grows back. A promise that what was taken will return. She'd cried when she read it. She was crying now, just thinking about it. A knock on the door made her jump. Mara? Tom Reeves's voice, uncertain and formal. Captain Hollister asked me to let you know the preacher's here. They're ready whenever you are. She took a deep breath, smoothing the front of her dress. Tell them I'll be right out. Yes, ma'am. His footsteps retreated, and Mara turned back to the mirror one last time. The woman staring back at her looked different than she had a few months ago. Not just the physical changes, the hair, the weight she'd regained, the color in her cheeks, but something deeper, something in her eyes. Hope. That's what it was. Hope, where there had been only emptiness before. All right, she whispered to her reflection. Let's do this. She stepped out of the cabin and into the sunlight. Luke was waiting for her beneath the cottonwood tree, dressed in a clean white shirt and his best trousers, his dark hair combed back from his face. When he saw her, his expression shifted, something raw and vulnerable passing across his features before settling into a smile that made her knees weak. She walked toward him, aware of the small audience watching. Tom Reeves, scrubbed clean and wearing a borrowed suit. Captain Hollister, resplendent in his dress uniform. The traveling preacher, an elderly man with kind eyes and a well-worn Bible. But they all faded into the background as she moved closer to Luke as his hand reached out to take hers. You look beautiful, he said quietly. You don't look so bad yourself. The preacher cleared his throat, and they turned to face him. Dearly beloved, he began, his voice carrying across the quiet yard. We are gathered here today to witness the union of Luke Barrett and Mara Hale. Marriage is a sacred covenant, entered into with intention and commitment, built on a foundation of mutual respect, trust, and love. Mara listened to the familiar words, but her attention kept drifting to Luke, to the strong lines of his jaw, the steady gray of his eyes, the way his thumb traced gentle circles on the back of her hand. This man who had walked into an alley and changed her life. This man who had seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up instead of pushing her down. This man who was about to become her husband. Do you, Luke Barrett, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until death do you part? Luke's voice was steady, unwavering. I do. And do you, Mara Hale, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, until death do you part? She met Luke's eyes, feeling tears prick at her own. I do. Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. The preacher smiled, closing his Bible. You may kiss your bride. Luke pulled her into his arms and kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, and Mara heard Tom Reeves whoop and Captain Hollister's dignified applause. But all of it was distant, muffled, overwhelmed by the thundering of her own heart. When they finally broke apart, she was laughing and crying at the same time. Hello, Mrs. Barrett, Luke said softly. Hello, Mr. Barrett, she replied. And just like that, she had a new name, a new life, a new beginning. The celebration that followed was small but joyful. Tom had brought a bottle of whiskey from Denver, and Hollister had contributed a case of wine from the officers' stores at Fort Laramie. The preacher turned out to have a surprisingly good singing voice, and soon they were all gathered around a fire as the sun began to set, trading stories and laughter. Mara sat beside Luke, her hand resting on his knee, watching the firelight play across the faces of these people who had become, against all odds, her friends. Tom, who had risked everything to warn them. Hollister, who had ridden through the night to save them. Even the preacher, a stranger who had traveled half a day just to marry a couple he'd never met. Kindness. That's what this was. Simple human kindness, offered without expectation of reward. She'd forgotten such things existed. A toast, Hollister said, raising his glass. To Luke and Mara Barrett, may your lives together be long, your troubles few, and your love enduring. Hear, hear, Tom agreed, lifting his own glass. They all drank, and Mara felt the warmth of the wine spread through her chest, mingling with a deeper warmth that had nothing to do with alcohol. Can I ask you something? Tom said, turning to Luke. Something I've been wondering about since this whole thing started? Go ahead. That day in the alley, the day you saved her, you didn't hesitate, not for a second. You just walked in like you knew exactly what you were doing. Tom shook his head in admiration. How? How did you know it would work? That they wouldn't just shoot you where you stood? Luke was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. I didn't know, he said finally. I didn't know anything except that I couldn't walk away. That if I turned my back on what was happening, I'd have to live with it for the rest of my life. He glanced at Mara, something tender in his gaze. Some things are worth the risk. She was worth the risk. Mara felt her throat tighten. She'd asked him the same question that first night in the cabin. He'd given her an answer then, but not this answer. Not the whole truth. I was scared, Luke continued, his voice low. More scared than I'd been in years. But I'd spent so long being afraid. Afraid of my past. Afraid of being found. Afraid of caring about anyone. And standing there, watching those people hurt her, I realized that fear had already taken everything from me. My family, my peace, my ability to connect with another human being. He shook his head slowly. I wasn't going to let it take her too. Silence fell around the fire, heavy with the weight of confession. Then Hollister raised his glass again. To courage, he said simply, and to the people who find it when it matters most. They drank again, and the conversation moved on to lighter topics. But Mara kept Luke's words close, turning them over in her mind like precious stones. Fear had controlled her life for so long. Fear of her father's debts, fear of the Garretts, fear of being alone. She'd let it dictate her choices, limit her possibilities, convince her that she was worthless and helpless and deserving of everything that happened to her. But Luke had refused to let fear win, and in doing so, he'd shown her a different way. As the fire burned low and their guests began to make their farewells, Mara felt a sense of peace settle over her that she'd never experienced before. Not the absence of feeling, not the numbness that had protected her during the worst of times, but something active, intentional, a choice to believe that the future could be better than the past. Tom was the first to leave, climbing onto his horse with a promise to write when he reached Denver. I'm going to tell your story, he said, looking down at them from the saddle. Both of your stories. People need to know what you did, what you survived. Just make sure you get the facts right, Luke said with a hint of a smile. I will, I promise. Tom touched his hat in farewell. Take care of each other. We will, Mara said, and she meant it. Hollister departed next, riding at the head of a small escort that had accompanied him from the fort. He shook Luke's hand firmly, then turned to Mara with an expression of unexpected warmth. Mrs. Barrett, he said, I've seen a lot of courage in my years of service. Men who charged into battle knowing they might not survive. Men who held their ground when every instinct told them to run. He paused, his blue eyes steady on hers. But what you did, what both of you did, that took a different kind of courage, the kind that doesn't show up in history books, but matters just as much. He touched the brim of his hat. It's been an honor. Then he was gone too, disappearing down the trail in a cloud of dust, and Mara and Luke were alone. They stood in the yard for a long moment, watching the last light fade from the sky. The stars were beginning to appear, scattered across the darkness, like the first night they'd spent together, when everything was still uncertain and the future was nothing but a question mark. So, Luke said finally, his arm coming up around her shoulders. What now? Mara considered the question. A few months ago, she would have had no answer. A few months ago, she couldn't imagine a future that extended beyond simple survival. But now, standing beside her husband on the land that had become their home, she found that she could imagine quite a lot. Now, she said, we live. The weeks that followed their wedding were filled with the quiet work of building a life. They repaired fences that had been neglected during the crisis, expanded the vegetable garden behind the cabin, brought in the last of the harvest before winter set in. Luke taught Mara how to can preserves and smoke meat, how to predict the weather by the behavior of the animals, how to prepare for the long months of cold that would soon descend on the mountains. She absorbed it all with the same hunger she'd shown since arriving at the ranch, a desperate need to be useful, to contribute, to prove that she was worth the space she occupied. But something was different now. The desperation was fading, replaced by something calmer, more sustainable. She was learning not because she had to, but because she wanted to. One afternoon in late October, she found Luke standing at the edge of their property, staring out at the mountains with an expression she couldn't quite read. What are you thinking about? She asked, coming to stand beside him. The past, he said quietly, and the future. How different they are from what I expected. Different good or different bad? Different good. He turned to look at her, something soft in his storm-gray eyes. When I first came here, I was running. From what I'd done, from who I'd been, from everything that reminded me of the person I used to be. I thought if I could just get far enough away, it would stop hurting. Did it work? For a while. Then it just became a different kind of pain. He reached out and took her hand, lacing their fingers together. But when you came, when I had something to fight for besides my own survival, everything changed. The past didn't disappear, but it stopped being the only thing that mattered. Mara squeezed his hand, understanding what he meant better than she could say. Her own past was still there too. Samuel's hollow eyes, Margaret Garrett's cold smile, the weight of the knife cutting through her hair. But those memories no longer defined her. They were part of her story, but not the end of it. I've been thinking, she said slowly, about what Tom said, about telling our story. What about it? He wanted to write about us, about what happened, what we survived. She paused, gathering her thoughts. But I don't think I want our story to be about surviving. I want it to be about living, about what comes after the worst is over. Luke considered this, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. What does that look like? I don't know exactly, but I think it starts here, with us, with this. She gestured at the ranch, the mountains, the vast expanse of sky overhead. We have a chance to build something, Luke, something real and good and lasting, and I don't want to waste it looking backward. He was quiet for a long moment. Then slowly, he smiled. That sounds like a plan. Winter came early that year, the first snow falling in mid-November and blanketing the ranch in white. Mara stood at the window, watching the flakes drift down, remembering another winter, the winter Samuel had died, when she'd been trapped in the Garrett house with nothing but her own fear for company. This winter would be different. The cabin was warm, the wood stove crackling cheerfully in the corner, The pantry was full of preserved food, enough to last them through the coldest months. And Luke was there, always there, reading by lamplight, or mending equipment, or simply sitting beside her, his presence a constant reassurance that she was no longer alone. "What are you thinking?" he asked, looking up from the harness he was repairing. "About last winter." She turned away from the window and settled into the chair across from him. "About how different this feels." "Different how?" "Safe." The word came out small, almost surprised, as if she still couldn't quite believe it. "I feel safe, Luke. Truly safe for the first time I can remember." He set aside the harness and leaned forward, taking her hands in his. "That's what home is supposed to feel like." "I know. I'm just still getting used to it." She laughed softly. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for something to go wrong." "Something will go wrong eventually. That's just life." His grip tightened on her hands. "But whatever it is, we'll face it together. That's what we promised each other." "Together," she repeated. The word had become a touchstone for them, a reminder of everything they'd been through and everything they'd built. The fire crackled, and outside the window the snow continued to fall, and Mara felt something loosen in her chest that she hadn't even realized was still tight. She was home. She was safe. She was loved. And that was enough. The first letter from Tom Reeves arrived in January, brought by a writer who'd braved the snowy trails from Denver. It was thick with pages, filled with news from the wider world and updates on his work at the newspaper. "The article about you is done," he wrote. "It's going to run next week. I told your story the way you would have wanted, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a story of courage and resilience. I hope I did it justice." Mara read the letter aloud to Luke, her voice catching on certain phrases. Tom had included a copy of the article itself, and they pored over it together, seeing their own story reflected back at them through someone else's eyes. It was strange reading about themselves, strange and slightly surreal, as if the people in the article were characters in a novel rather than flesh and blood human beings. But there was truth in it too, a truth that Tom had captured with surprising skill. "He's a good writer," Luke said when they'd finished. "He is." Mara folded the article carefully and set it aside. "Do you think it will make a difference? People reading this, knowing what happened?" "I don't know, maybe. If even one person reads it and decides to stand up for someone who needs help, then it was worth it." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "But even if it doesn't change anything out there, it matters to us. It's our story, finally told the way it should be." She nodded, leaning into his embrace. The article was a gift, she realized. A recognition of everything they'd been through, preserved in ink and paper for anyone who wanted to know. Their story mattered. They mattered, and that was something she would never take for granted again. Spring came slowly to the mountains, the snow melting in patches to reveal the first green shoots of new growth. Mara watched the land come back to life with a sense of wonder she'd almost forgotten she was capable of feeling. It had been almost a year since Luke had pulled her out of that alley. Almost a year since she'd arrived at this ranch, broken and bleeding, certain that her life was over. And now here she was, married, safe, happy in a way she'd never dared to imagine. The changes weren't just internal. Her hair had grown back, falling in soft waves past her shoulders now. She'd gained weight, her face losing the gaunt hollowness of those terrible months. And there was something else, too. Something she'd only just begun to suspect. She told Luke on a morning in early April, when the meadows were dotted with wildflowers and the air smelled of rain and possibility. "I think I'm pregnant." He stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then a smile spread across his face, slow at first, then widening until it transformed his entire countenance. "Are you sure?" "Pretty sure. I've missed 2 cycles and I've been feeling sick in the mornings." She pressed a hand to her stomach, still flat beneath her dress. "I didn't want to say anything until I was more certain, but—" She didn't get to finish the sentence. Luke swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around until she was laughing and dizzy and begging him to stop. "A baby," he said, setting her down but keeping his hands on her waist. "We're going to have a baby. We're going to have a baby." Saying it out loud made it feel more real. "Is this okay? I know we didn't plan—" It's more than okay. He cupped her face in his hands, his gray eyes bright with something that looked like tears. It's everything, everything I never knew I wanted. She kissed him then, pouring all of her love and fear and hope into the contact. A baby. A new life, created from the love they'd built together. A future that extended beyond the two of them into generations yet to come. I'm scared, she admitted when they finally broke apart. I don't know how to be a mother. I never had a good example. Neither did I. Luke rested his forehead against hers. But we'll figure it out. Together. There was that word again. Together. The foundation on which their entire relationship had been built. Together, she echoed. And for the first time since she'd discovered the pregnancy, the fear began to ease. The months that followed were filled with preparation and anticipation. Luke built a cradle from wood he'd cut and cured himself, sanding each piece until it was smooth as silk. Mara sewed tiny clothes and blankets, her fingers growing more skilled with each passing week. They talked about names, arguing, joking, finally settling on a list of possibilities they could both agree on. Summer ripened into autumn, and Mara's belly grew round beneath her dresses. She felt the baby move for the first time in August, a flutter like butterfly wings that made her cry with joy. Luke spent hours with his hand pressed to her stomach, waiting for each kick, each roll, each sign of the life growing inside her. He's strong, Luke said one evening, feeling a particularly vigorous movement. She, Mara corrected with a smile. We'll see. They'd decided not to argue about it. Boy or girl, the baby would be loved. That was all that mattered. The labor began on a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year and 1 week after their wedding. Mara woke with a gasp, her hands flying to her stomach as the first contraction tightened around her like a fist. Luke, she breathed. Luke, it's time. What followed was the longest, most exhausting, most terrifying experience of her life. The pain came in waves, each one cresting higher than the last, until she felt like she was drowning in it. Luke never left her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement, even when she cursed at him between contractions. The midwife, a woman from a neighboring ranch who'd agreed to make the journey when Mara's time came, was calm and competent, guiding her through each stage with practiced ease. But it was Luke's voice Mara clung to, Luke's presence that anchored her when the pain threatened to sweep her away. You can do this, he said over and over. You're the strongest person I know. You can do this. And somehow, impossibly, she did. The baby arrived just as the sun was setting, filling the cabin with golden light. A girl, pink and squalling, with a tuft of dark hair and eyes that would eventually turn the same storm gray as her father's. She's perfect, the midwife said, placing the baby in Mara's arms. Absolutely perfect. Mara stared down at her daughter, tears streaming down her face. This tiny, precious creature, this miracle of flesh and blood and bone, had come from her. From them. From the love they'd built out of ashes and pain and the stubborn refusal to give up. Hello? She whispered. Hello, little one. Luke sat on the edge of the bed, one arm around Mara, the other reaching out to touch their daughter's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around his, instinctive and trusting, and something broke open in his face, something that had been closed for a very long time. What should we call her? He asked, his voice rough with emotion. Mara had thought about this moment for months. They'd discussed names, debated options, made lists, and crossed them out and started over. But looking at her daughter now, only one name felt right. Hope, she said softly. I want to call her Hope. Luke was silent for a long moment, understanding everything the name implied. Then he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the baby's face. Hope, he repeated. That's perfect. And it was. After everything they'd been through, the pain, the fear, the seemingly endless darkness, they'd found their way to this moment. This cabin, this family, this future they'd built together from nothing but determination and love. Hope wasn't just their daughter's name, it was the story of their lives, condensed into a single word. The baby yawned, her tiny mouth forming a perfect O, and then settled into sleep against Mara's chest. Outside, the last light faded from the sky, and the stars began to appear, the same stars that had witnessed their first night together, their wedding, their long journey from strangers to partners to parents. "We did it," Mara said quietly. "We actually did it." "We did." Luke pressed a kiss to her forehead, then to their daughters. "And this is just the beginning." She looked up at him, this man who had saved her life and given her a reason to live. This man who had taught her that strength wasn't about never falling. It was about getting up again, every time, no matter how hard or how long it took. "I love you," she said, "more than I ever thought possible." "I love you too." He smiled, and in that smile she saw everything. The past they'd overcome, the present they'd built, the future stretching out before them like an endless road. Forever and always. Mara closed her eyes, her daughter warm in her arms, her husband solid beside her, and felt a peace so complete it was almost overwhelming. They had survived. They had fought and bled and nearly died, but they had survived. And now, in this quiet cabin in the mountains, surrounded by the family they'd created, they were finally, truly home. The story of Mara and Luke Barrett would be told for years to come. In Tom Reeves' newspaper articles, in the letters they wrote to friends and family, in the memories passed down to Hope, and the children who would follow her. It was a story of cruelty and courage, of despair and determination, of two broken people who found wholeness in each other. But more than anything, it was a story of hope. The hope that had sustained them through the darkest moments. The hope that had given them the strength to keep fighting when all seemed lost. The hope they now held in their arms, sleeping peacefully as the night settled around them. They had built a life from nothing. They had proven that even the most shattered souls could be made whole again. And as Mara drifted off to sleep, her last thought was not of the past, not of the alley, not of the garrets, not of any of the horrors she'd endured. Her last thought was of the morning, of waking up beside the man she loved, in the home they'd built, with their daughter between them, of breakfast and chores and the simple, beautiful routine of ordinary days, of living, at last, instead of just surviving. And that, in the end, was everything.